All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. Today that is me and my guest here, I'll introduce in a second. We're going to be talking about the resurrection and discussing the RHBS model and its alternatives. I've just left YouTube on, so I'm hearing myself. So my guest today is Tavo, who I only found out about fairly recently. He sent me an email in response to one of my recent videos about the RHBS model and reached out and suggested we could do a discussion. So Tavo, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you here today?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Just to continue the conversation that we had at the beginning of the video before we started the live stream, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that your channel is really fantastic. The content that you've developed around RHBS is really wonderful. I'm going to be arguing from the contrary perspective, but that doesn't diminish the degree to which I really hold this argument in very high esteem. And I think it's quite compelling. And I hope after we're done with the formal part of the debate, we can have a bit of a discussion on, some points where I do admire it to a greater degree. I'd also be remiss if I didn't say that, for somebody who's as early on in their career at this as you are, you've really got a stunning body of work. And if people haven't already checked out your website, I would encourage them to do that. There's like some really fun stuff, like a song about the periodic table, and and you're a great singer. And there's like an entire undergraduate course on like logic and philosophy and theology, and so really great resources. There's like a PowerPoint on the solar system with some very original research built into it, which is really very insightful and really amazing. So yeah, if you only know Dr. Fodor's work through this channel, please definitely check out his website. There's a lot of really fantastic work, and I feel very pleased and very privileged to be here having this discussion with you.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you, and I'm pleased that we could make this happen. So tell us a bit about yourself. We've told everyone about me. What about you?
Okay, yeah, good question. So I'm a professor in a field that is not related to theology at all. So I'm in a very different field. I got interested in this topic several years ago, a little bit, but I was an atheist for a long time, and then I would say, I was an agnostic for some transitional period. And then I sort of switched over, and I came to accept that there's, I think, at least a lot of interesting historical evidence that the teachings of Jesus have some unique merit to them. But I should say again that I don't have any theological backing. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a minister. So no one should take anything that I say in this conversation as an endorsement of any specific theological viewpoint. This is kind of more for my own education, my own learning, my own intellectual growth. And yeah, it's not to advocate any theology for any specific person. I'm definitely not a theologist. I don't have any theological credentials. Most of my credentials are in the field of manuscript criticism. So, and that does not extend to the New Testament. It's mostly doing scholarly research work, where I'm an editor for 2 different journals. And for the main journal in my field, I'm one of the most acclaimed reviewers in the history of the journal. So I've read a lot of papers, in other words, and I've got some skill in criticizing papers, but that's the extent. And again, no formal training in anything theological.
Oh, that's very cool. And just to clarify, Tavo is not your real name. That's a pseudonym. Just if anyone's.
I do this under a pseudonym. Yeah,
yeah. Yeah, that's fine. Just in case anyone's confused or is Googling things or something like that. So now. Just the next thing I'll talk about is just the format for this evening. So we're going to be debating, what was the exact wording we agreed to? The topic is, the RHBS model provides a better explanation of the post-crucifixion facts than the resurrection hypothesis. So I quite like this formulation of the topic because it's contrastive. So we're comparing 2 different explanations with a focus on the RHBS, but Tavo will be telling us about the way he prefers to think about these things. So I'll be going first because I'm arguing in the affirmative that the RHBS model is a better explanation than the resurrection hypothesis. And so opening statements will be 15 to 20 minutes-ish, and then we'll have 10 minutes of rebuttal each, 5 minutes of a second round of rebuttal, and then we'll move to open discussion for 30, 40 minutes, something like that. We'll see how we go. So that sound good? Any lingering issues, Tavo, before we start?
No, I mean, if people have comments, you can put, I think that this is live on YouTube, so feel free to put comments just in case I have to. I imagine after about an hour or so, I might want to take a bathroom break or something. So, yeah.
Oh, sure. No worries. Yeah. So please put your questions, comments in the chat. We'll see if we can get to those potentially in the discussion, depending on how things go. All right, I will make a start then. Let me make sure I can share this correctly. Okay, cool. Start my timer. All right, so thanks again, Tavo, for coming this evening, and thanks everyone for joining us either live chat or later on YouTube. So today I'm going to be advocating for the RHBS model as the best explanation for the facts surrounding the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And so in order to make sense of that, first of all, I need to introduce the facts that I'm trying to explain. So we can get into this a little bit more in a bit more detail later if necessary, but broadly speaking, the facts that I'm trying to account for, well, first of all, I'm assuming that Jesus was a teacher and that he was known as a miracle worker and so forth, that he had followers, and that he was crucified by the Romans. I'm just taking those as given background knowledge. I'm also assuming that he was buried. The facts that I'm trying to then explain are the empty tomb. So I'm assuming that that's a historical fact that I need to account for, that Jesus then was reported to appear to his disciples, that they believed he appeared to them after he had died in both individual and group contexts, and that shortly thereafter they, that is his disciples, developed a belief that Jesus had been resurrected, that he had returned from the dead in some sort of bodily form. So these are the background facts that I'm seeking to explain, or specifically the three on the right-hand side are the ones I'm seeking to explain with the RHBS model. So again, just to emphasize this, I'm not saying that all of these are historical facts. What I'm doing is taking for the sake of argument that these are historical facts and then seeing how well they can be explained by different approaches. And that's sort of the focus of the debate this evening. Now, let me just speak very briefly about what an explanation is and what it's supposed to do. In my view, an explanation is trying to tell us how and why a particular set of facts or observations occurred, like why we saw those things, why those things happened instead of something else. Charles Peirce talked about this as an explanation showing how the facts that it seeks to explain follow as a matter of course from the explanation that you give. And I think this is a good way to put it. So we can assess explanations in terms of the explanatory scope, the range of facts they can account for, their explanatory power, how probable or likely they render those facts, and the plausibility of the postulates that are made by the explanation, given our background knowledge. So what I'm arguing is that on these criteria, the RHBS model is a superior explanation of the facts that I mentioned than the resurrection hypothesis. I'll let Tavo sort of outline a bit later what he thinks the resurrection hypothesis is and how he thinks about it. And I'll discuss more about what I think about it in the rebuttal. The basic idea, though, is that it's a supernatural account that God rose Jesus from the dead and Jesus then appeared to his followers subsequently. So let's then talk about what the RHBS model is. Now, I presume many people watching this video have some familiarity with the RHBS model. I'm going to go a bit faster than I have in some presentations, but I'll include a link in the description to a longer video where I've talked about this stuff in more detail. But let me just outline the components of the RHBS model, and then we'll go through and see how they fit together, and I'll talk about some of the plausibility behind them. So the R stands for reburial, or actually it stands for removal, but removal of Jesus's body. But here I'm just going to talk about reburial as I think the most plausible explanation for that. So the idea is that Jesus's body was removed from the tomb before Sunday morning, probably by Joseph of Arimathea as a reburial. Then the next thing that happened is that following the discovery of this empty tomb on Sunday morning, one or more of Jesus's followers, probably initially the women, maybe Peter later on, experienced an individual bereavement hallucination of Jesus appearing to them. Then subsequently, the women told the disciples and/or Peter told the disciples about this experience. The disciples then sort of expected that they might have a similar experience. So that developed an expectation that led the disciples in a religious context to have a collective experience of Jesus appearing to them. That experience, as well as subsequent recollections of that experience, were shaped by various cognitive biases, including memory distortions, reconstructive recall, social memory contagion, irrational belief persistence, and cognitive dissonance, which reshaped the experience from what it sort of truly was, quote unquote, to like an unbiased observer there, to how they interpreted it as Jesus appearing bodily to them. And then through socialization processes, any disagreement or doubts or different interpretations were muted, and a sort of a common story, a common recollection of that was developed and then propagated eventually in early creeds. And then versions of that are reported in the Gospels. So that's it, the RHBS model in brief. Let me then go through some of the components and see how they fit together. Sorry to throw all this out quite quickly. I'm just showing this diagram here to illustrate how the different components interact, because I think sometimes critics don't appreciate that the RHBS model is an interconnected series of elements and not just a sort of set of separable items. Importantly here, the idea is that the reburial of Jesus's body led to the tomb being empty, which then, when it was discovered by the disciples, led to an expectancy that, well, something must explain this. Like, why is the tomb empty? Now, that needs to be considered in light of the context of Jesus's death, which was obviously not expected by his followers. They expected him to, they thought he was the Messiah. They expected him to redeem Israel, not be killed by the Romans. So they were confused, they were afraid, and they were trying to make sense of this. You combine that with the empty tomb and the cognitive dissonance, which I'll talk about in a moment, of trying to make sense of this unexpected event, led to or contributed to the individual hallucinations, which in turn contributed to the collective experiences, which were constructed, in my view, through a series of psychological and sociological processes, including like selective attention, suggestibility, and then memory distortions later on. So let me then talk about some of the details of the particular elements, and specifically why we should think these are plausible. And hopefully throughout the course of this debate, we can draw out some of these in more detail. So the idea in brief of the reburial is that we know that Jewish law said that the bodies, crucified or other bodies, should be removed from the cross before the Sabbath began, because that would be a contamination of the holiness of the Sabbath. John mentions this, that the day of preparation, that the Sabbath was approaching. It was the day of preparation before the Sabbath. The tomb was nearby, so they laid Jesus there to get it all done before the Sabbath began. So that's a baseline plausibility for why the body was put there in the first place. The idea there is that it was placed there temporarily. It was always intended to be a temporary, not really burial, more of a storage for the duration of the Sabbath until it could be moved as soon as the Sabbath had ended, which was Saturday evening. The Gospels support this by indicating that the burial was rushed. So evening had already come. It was a preparation day, the day before the Sabbath. And so again, there's an indication there of a need to find a solution to the problem of what to do with Jesus's body quickly, and a nearby burial site would be suitable. Now, the other reason for why Jesus's body was placed in the Josephus tomb, not Josephus tomb, was placed in the tomb according to this hypothesis, is that the Romans were also concerned about civil disorder. There'd already been almost been a riot when Jesus was convicted and sentenced. And so that they didn't want that to be repeated. A quiet, private burial site was desirable for this reason. And so the idea is that Jesus was placed temporarily in Joseph's tomb and the body removed as soon as possible, which was Saturday evening. And that's why on Sunday morning, when the women came to dress the body or finish dressing the body, the tomb was empty. I have some concerns about that, but we'll maybe discuss those in the rebuttals just for sake of time. Now, the next element there is it's Sunday morning. The women followers, according to the Gospels, they were the first to go to the tomb to dress Jesus's body. The Gospels differ slightly as to like how many women and things like that, but let's not worry about that here. They go to the tomb. They see the tomb's empty. And remember, the context here is that they are in grief and confused about Jesus's death. So the hypothesis then is that that context and the empty tomb triggered bereavement hallucinations. Bereavement hallucinations are very common. In fact, we don't even really need to postulate the empty tomb to explain them, but that may have contributed, according to my view. So one study found that 40% of the sample of the general population in these countries reported some sort of hallucinatory experience. That's a general survey. Post-bereavement hallucinations specifically were reported in about half of subjects for feeling the presence of someone, and about a third either saw, heard, or spoke to someone after they had experienced a bereavement. So we know from psychology bereavement hallucinations are very common. And so the idea that at least one or more of the women disciples, and then possibly Peter later on, again, depending on which gospel you follow, experienced an individual bereavement hallucination where they believed that Jesus appeared to them, it is really quite plausible. So we then take this individual hallucination plus the empty tomb, which was reported to the rest of the disciples by the women and or Peter. This then is the key triggering factor, according to the RHBS model, for the collective experiences of the risen Jesus. D.H. Rawcliffe here has written about how similar factors operate in an individual case as in group cases. He uses the term mass hallucinations here, but I prefer collective experiences because I don't think they're technically hallucinations. But the idea here is that two people in the group setting don't have exactly the same experience. It's not identical in all respects, but it's close enough such that they collectively shape together an experience for themselves. And then subsequent discussion harmonizes those accounts and fails to highlight any inconsistencies. And there's strong socialization processes to prevent that sort of inconsistency from coming out. And so I think that what happened here is that the disciples were probably in a room. They were probably somewhere in Jerusalem, at least according to some of the Gospels. I think Luke and John talk about this. They were probably hidden up somewhere in Jerusalem, fasting, praying, reading the scriptures, discussing, trying to make sense of what happened. They were feeling very upset, very confused, but also particularly following the report about the individual appearances, right, by Peter and all the women, they were hopeful that like something might be happening. I don't think at that point they understood, that they didn't think it was resurrection then, but they were hopeful that they might receive some sort of revelation or some sort of sign that would vindicate their hope and make sense of what was happening. And I think that as part of that process, some sort of self-reinforcing attentional process occurred, which is where this has been studied.
James, I think you cut out there. I think you may be frozen, James. I apologize if it's on my end that you're frozen. It looks like we're still live, but it looks like you're frozen, James. You know, can somebody put in the comments if you can hear me and not James, and then I'll refresh my own browser if you can't. Give me a thumbs up or something in the comments. Can anyone hear? Can somebody just comment in the comment section if you can, if you're able to hear me? So I'm not sure if we're live or not. I think we've lost James. Again, feel free to put a comment if you can hear me and you can't hear James. If you can hear me, then I know the problem is on James' end. If it's let's see here. Okay, I'm going to stay in the chat because I think what happened is James dropped off. And I think I saw at least a few comments saying that people can hear me but not James. So that means that I think the problem is on James's end. So in other words, I'm not going to go ahead and refresh my screen. But why don't I do this? Let me try and answer a question from the comment section. Are there any questions in the comment section? Does anyone in the comment section have a question you want to ask? And I'll see if I can. Yeah, okay. I'm seeing your comments now that say that you can hear me and not James. I think the problem is that James dropped off the chat for some reason. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for me in the comment section? Okay, how plausible is the reburial given background knowledge? You know, I'll get into this a little bit more in the debate. That's a question from Dale of Real Seekers, and if you haven't checked out his channel, he's got a really wonderful channel. So please check out Dale's channel. I personally don't think there's any confirming or affirming information on the reburial. if you believe in the reburial, if you believe the reburial happened, then that, I think there's another contention that has to go along with that, and that is that that you have to accept that that Josephus was for some reason silent about the reburial when he could have told people. Now, this is surprising because there was presumably a lot of communication between the disciples and the family of Jesus, and at least some authority for the reburial would have fallen on the family of Jesus. So I think that is sort of at least one of the gaps in the reburial. There's some other issues with the reburial that I think are a little bit difficult, and I'll get into this more in my argument. One of the reasons is the Nicodemus spice problem. We know that Nicodemus spent the equivalent of several thousands of dollars on the spices. It's unlikely that Nicodemus would have done that if he had known that the body would be temporary. So that presupposes that Joseph of Arimathea had a tomb that he was not telling his colleagues that the body would be moved. There's also a problem with the fact that this is a new tomb. All the synoptic gospels report that the tomb is new. So this is all in answer to your question, Dale. I think the new tomb is harder to reconcile because if you had something that was valuable, like a new tomb, then, oh, I think James is back. Yeah, my understanding is James is back. Okay. I've just been answering some questions from the comment section, James. You dropped off.
No worries.
You dropped off a bit ago, so.
Yes, well, my entire system locked up. I have no idea what happened. It's never done that before. What was the last thing that I said? Because I'm not exactly sure when you lost
were,
me.
Can you shoot.
Hang on,
Can
I
you
can bring up
start
my
with your
slides
diagram
again.
and just go forward, and I'll tell you when we lost you? Because I should have written down what screen you were on.
Did you see this screen?
Yes, yeah, we saw this screen. I think we saw the next screen. I think you were talking about Rowcliffe's work. We definitely didn't see this screen.
Yeah, so I got past that. My computer locked up on this screen. So hopefully, okay. Yes, I can just restart from there. Was there anything you wanted to finish saying that you were talking about?
No, I wanted to go ahead and penalize you for the time that you missed. This counts against your total.
Oh, it's so annoying. I don't understand what happened. It just the whole system didn't respond at all. Like I just had to do a hard reset. It's not even doing anything. It's just, I guess the StreamYards, I don't know. Anyway, I've got 12 minutes on my clock, so I'll resume from there. I might go a little bit over 15. Okay, let me just, where's my slides? Okay, so sorry about that, everyone. Let me restart my clock here. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. So I was talking about the collective experiences of the risen Jesus, which I think that the disciples had as they gathered together in a room in Jerusalem somewhere. And I was telling you about how I think these got started was through self-reinforcing attentional processes. So this has been studied in the context of paranormal events where, in fact, that these can be triggered experimentally. You give people suggestions that they may experience something unusual or paranormal, and then people begin to label ambiguous events as like abnormal or paranormal or like whatever the appropriate language is. In a spiritual context, it would be using spiritual terms. This has also been studied with faith healings and other contexts like that, high energy sort of social environments. And then once the labeling has begun, this leads to a sort of a positive feedback process where some people identify something which they then label as, say, paranormal, which then leads to a greater expectation of someone else to identify something else. And this leads to what's called a self-reinforcing attentional process. So this is one mechanism of these, I think, collective experiences. And another important aspect is cognitive dissonance. I mentioned this briefly before, but just to go into a little bit more detail, cognitive dissonance is a cognitive phenomenon whereby people who have experienced some sort of falsification or apparent falsification of a deeply held belief, often in a religious context, but doesn't have to be, then find some sort of way of resolving that dissonance, which is that they strongly believe something was going to happen or that something was true, but then the prediction doesn't occur or something apparently falsifies that belief. They try to resolve that usually through some sort of justification process. So often failed predictions don't convince people to abandon these sorts of beliefs. Sometimes they do, but in many cases, there's some sort of rationalization. And in many cases, Scholar Milton has talked about the spiritualization. So a prophecy or a belief is thought to have really taken place, but instead of in a literal, physical, verifiable way, it's interpreted as a sort of a spiritual occurrence. So I think that this sort of process was also occurring as the disciples were trying to make sense of what happened to Jesus, and in particular his messianic claims. They were trying to make sense of how he was the Messiah, but also was killed by the Romans. And this, I think, fed into the way they interpreted their experiences of Jesus appearing to them. Now, I've talked at length in various debates and also in my book about various other miracle examples throughout history that have been documented and in which groups of people have reported experiencing miraculous things. I think that these, I'm just showing some examples here. I won't go into details here. Each individual case is unique and there are different elements to it. But I think that the fact that we see similar sorts of collective experiences documented in other traditions across history highlights that similar processes are occurring, these similar sort of processes of self-reinforcing attentional processes and memory distortion. I'll talk more about that in a second, as well as cognitive dissonance and other factors are operative elsewhere. And so the resurrection appearances, although different to all of the others, are also, I think, not wholly different, and we can find parallels in some ways. So that's important for illustrating how these processes are at work. Eyewitness testimony is something that's often appealed to, particularly by many apologists, as being very convincing, is the fact that there are so many separate, like multiple of the disciples separately reported having experienced Jesus appearing to them. It's not just a single individual. However, we do know from psychology that eyewitness testimony is often quite unreliable. I'm showing a case here of someone who was convinced that they had correctly identified their attacker, whereas in fact that they had been, they'd misremembered and that they actually picked out the wrong person in a lineup. They were later vindicated through DNA evidence. And one of the reasons for unreliability of eyewitness testimony is that people engage in retellings of events and also discussions with other people, especially if they remembered things and encoded the information in a group setting. People often confabulate details that go along with what they expected to observe at an event. That's a form of memory distortion. But also, memories can be contaminated by things that are reported by other people who were also at the event. And this is called memory conformity, that people tend to incorporate details from other people into their own memories. So what we have here is a process that the early disciples certainly engaged in, which is following the initial collective experience. They certainly would have discussed that with each other, tried to make sense of it, incorporate that into their understandings of Jesus, retold the events, prayed about it, referred to the scriptures, and they were, we know, in a very close-knit communal setting with a very sort of distinctive belief system. This is precisely the sort of environment in which memory distortion, contamination, and these other effects are most likely to occur. And that's just finishing up here. That's why I think that we see, let me put it another way. That's why the resurrection is somewhat distinctive here, or the environment of the resurrection appearances. Because some apologists have argued to me that if perception and memory are so unreliable, then how is it that we get by, in everyday cases? Or conversely, why is it that these processes are usually reliable enough, but then they're unreliable in the case of the early disciples? Or they're only unreliable for miraculous cases. They argue that that's ad hoc. But I mean, this may come out more in the discussion this evening. But the argument that I'm making is that the different psychological and sociological processes are operative in different contexts. In normal contexts, everyday contexts, memory is often accurate enough, although I still think it's less accurate than many people think it is, but that's a further discussion. But there are specific circumstances that are known to lead to and facilitate the formation of false memories and false interpretations of events. One, and among these, are highly charged religious contexts, expectations of a certain event happening, or certain theological expectations being highly salient, and a supportive social context, especially when that's sort of a close-knit group that's somewhat separated from the mainstream. And so I think that this sort of environment, combined with obviously the highly unusual events and highly emotive events of Jesus being crucified and then finding the empty tomb, is what explains why it is that the disciples were in sort of the perfect context to lead to this initial collective experience with the self-reinforcing attentional processes, which then was subsequently affected by cognitive dissonance and memory distortions, and led them to develop the belief that Jesus had been resurrected. So that will conclude my opening remarks, and I'm looking forward to continuing the debate. So I'll pass over to Tavo now.
All right, thanks very much. And I've I've put two PowerPoint files in the. So I'll start with, I think, RHBS Critique version 4, which should be there in the PowerPoint. Let me see if I can add it to the stage myself. Okay, great. Okay. So I'm just going to, let's see if I can page forward. No, I can't, but that's okay. I'll just use the buttons here. All right, let me start my timer just to keep me honest. And again, a really wonderful opening statement. Okay, so what I'm first going to do is present, and that's my time starting. Even though my time is limited, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Dr. Fodor. Again, he's got a really fantastic body of work, and I feel very privileged to be here and be part of the conversation. Even though I'm arguing mostly from the negative perspective on RHBS, I think there are some wonderful aspects of the argument. And then next, I'll do my CTF model. And let's see. Okay, all right. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to skip over some of these slides because I have to trim at least some of my time. But my challenge to those who favor the RHBS argument is: do you actually believe that it's a likely or probable explanation, or do you just believe that it's very or even exceedingly unlikely, but at least more likely in the resurrection? And the reason why that's important to ask that question is because it is non-scientific and fallacious to choose a theory just because you're really opposed to the alternative. And it looks like there's, all right. So it looks like there's some issue with my slides, that it duplicated the slides when I converted it to PowerPoint just now. So hopefully that's not going to be a huge issue. I'll just have to click through and hopefully it'll work okay. All right. So my first argument is I actually looked at the features of RHBS and I applied it to historical events between 10 CE and 60 CE to see if it actually worked out. So what I did is I looked at 32 different events in the 1st century, mostly in Judea, but throughout the Roman Empire also. And I determined whether or not RHBS would compel us to reject events as untrue. I did send this argument 48 hours in advance to Dr. Fodor, just so you'd have some chance to review it. But basically, these are all events that scholars agree actually happened, and RHBS would compel us to reject these events as untrue based on features of RHBS. So 50% of the time, even though these events actually happened, RHBS forces us to reject. So this suggests that, I'll skip over some of these slides, but these are the 32 events that I looked at. I know this font is a little bit small on your screen probably, and it looks like some of my formatting has changed because I just converted the documents to PowerPoint. But these are the 16 events that RHBS would compel us to reject, so about 50% of the events. So that means that RHBS empirically fails when we apply it to events other than the resurrection. And that means that we should at least recognize that it's really more of a bulwark for a metaphysical commitment dressed up as historical methodology. All right, argument number 2. RHBS does amplify some known biases. I'm going to talk a little bit about public sphere biases and also biases in the scholarly literature. There are biases towards reporting novel or surprising conclusions. There's also a bias towards over-reporting of cognitive biases. There's things like rejection of the null hypothesis. The problem is reliable functional memory is mundane and seldomly reported. Rosenthal called this the file drawer problem, where if you don't have an interesting result, you file it away. Franco et al. Said that the problem is that if you have a contention that doesn't, and results that don't refute the null hypothesis, you're less likely to have your results published. And Wickstead et al. Developed this into an argument specifically about eyewitness memory and the fact that we underestimate the likelihood of eyewitness memory. Other people have also talked about there's a bias towards reporting cognitive biases. Gigerenzer et al. Said that often these experiments are designed to specifically elicit errors in order to give an inflated impression of human irrationality. Neisser et al. Also said this, that these are often artificial tasks that are meant to exaggerate error. And also lots of other people have written on the issue of the bias towards reporting cognitive biases. So the scientific literature underscoring cognitive biases ought to be at least reviewed skeptically. All right, next argument, RHBS does rely on an unproven assumption of epistemic privilege. So we're saying that we can reliably currently construct which events were hallucinations, which were confabulations, which were genuine experiences. But on the other hand, the disciples themselves, who are closer in time, space, and testimony, are treated as fundamentally unreliable interpreters of their own experiences. So in effect, the witnesses can't tell what they experienced, but the modern analyst can, and this asymmetry is never justified. And the modern scholar has biases as well, like overstatement of cognitive bias, mistrust of eyewitnesses, presentism, and personal metaphysical commitments. So the skipped fundamental step of RHBS ought to be justification for the inherent epistemic privilege, but this step is never provided. There's also the problem of selective reference to scriptural resources. RHBS is predicated upon and cites specific scriptural resources for narrative elements and as evidentiary support. But because certain verses are thrown out and other verses are accepted, there's no real criteria that tells us which ones we should accept and which ones we should reject. So here's some examples of verses that Dr. Fodor accepts, ones that he rejects. And the evaluative criteria for assessing reliability of sources is never in advance delineated. This is another fundamental step. It should be provided in RHBS, and it isn't. There's also the unobservable cascade problem of RHBS. It's more complex, less constrained, less evidentially anchored, and it seeks to replace the resurrection hypothesis with very opaque contentions. So these are all the events that need to happen in RHBS. RHBS requires all of them to happen in the correct order without breakdown, contradiction, or schism. And here's the bigger problem, is that you have to have about 15 agents in RHBS by my count, and I think that's a pretty conservative estimate, who have to be following the precise choreography delineated by RHBS in order to make the mechanism work. If you don't have anyone acting in concert, then the whole analysis falls apart. Now, these are very generous estimates of what the probability is of each step of RHBS. And if we multiply all these together to get the total probability, we're already to a number that's down to about 1 in 8,000. And these are probably still very generous estimates of likelihood. And this is probably generous still, since every event needs to happen exactly in the right sequence. So which is more likely? 15 independent actors following this precise choreography without affirming evidence, or just one with at least some testimony by somewhere between 800 to 500 individuals. Now, there's also the problem where RHBS is incompatible with what we know about a universe where there is some divine hiddenness in theology. So the RHBS model sort of implicitly assumes that if a resurrection had occurred, the evidence would be so overwhelming that you couldn't have a naturalistic alternative that would be constructible. So, but the problem is, we know from just looking around the universe that there is some component of divine hiddenness. And so that's exactly what we would actually exactly predict from our theological universe, where there is some component of divine hiddenness, that the constructibility of alternatives is something that would be predicted by that model. So you can't simultaneously use that as evidence against the hypothesis. So we predict in a universe with divine hiddenness that a naturalistic escape hatch would be accessible through intellectual backflips and contortions. And so, in other words, even if you have an improbable set of alternative explanations, that's exactly a counterfactual that's being fulfilled here. Now, I'm going to skip over these slides because I'm going to get to some of them in my later PowerPoint. But we do have earlier, more robust, and more quickly repeated attestations for the resurrection than almost any other certainly any ancient theological claim. So from a Gestalt perspective, to me, RHBS feels like it's a series of sort of intellectual contortions and backflips to get us out of accepting the available attestation. And a conclusion that seems supported but can be escaped through intellectual contortions is exactly what we would expect in our model of divine hiddenness. All right, argument 7. There's a framework for argumentation against Christianity, but you never apply RHBS to test cases. We do have analogies, but there's no historical validation. So the historical examples are used illustratively, but not applicatively. And as a result, there's no positive discriminatory power, and there's no systemic validation. All right, argument 8 is the unfocused explanandum problem. So in other words, this argument is that RHBS offers on 2 levels. It's a sort of level 1 says, here's some mechanisms by which false religious beliefs can emerge and persist. And level 2 is, therefore, the resurrection is itself a false belief. Now, when you put these two together, especially in rapid succession, they do seem very rhetorically persuasive, but there is a logical gap here, clearly. And to illustrate this another way, I could, if somebody says, I'm interested in investing money, I could rhetorically argue to them that they shouldn't invest because there's a lot of Ponzi schemes out there. But that's really a weak argument. The stronger argument is this particular investment that you're considering has features of a Ponzi scheme. So in other words, we have to take the features of RHBS and show specifically that Christianity instantiates those features in order to make the strong contention possible. So yes, we can have religious beliefs. They can be the result of fraught processes. That doesn't necessarily show that the resurrection is itself the result of a fraught process. So RHBS is rhetorically persuasive, but does it lead us with a coherent set of arguments, or does it just sprinkle doubts over a canopy and then tell us that Christianity is the theology beneath that canopy? And I'm clicking forward. Okay, here we go. There's also the problem of auxiliary hypothesis creep. So if we have to add on a lot of auxiliary hypotheses, then this tells us that essentially we've got issues that the core theory can't explain. And this suggests that our theory is being unnaturally propped up rather than naturally explaining the data. There's a lot of auxiliaries in RHBS. I calculated 43 different auxiliary hypotheses. Even conservatively, though, I think we still need 15 to 25 auxiliary and independent hypotheses. And the problem is this is illustrated by the example of machine learning. You can have machine learning that performs exquisitely well on a task because you've basically built in parameters to explain every fluctuation in the data that goes into the machine learning algorithm. But the problem is when you have such an overfitted example, then you get collapse when you're confronted with a new task. This is kind of what we have with RHBS. There's a lot of different parameters. that we put in to explain a lot of different observations. And if we apply this to the example of machine learning, we can see how that would fall apart when we have a case that's an unknown, and that's problematic at least. All right, number 10, the contextuality problem. So I've previously argued widely that we shouldn't hyper-focus on the evidence for or against the resurrection, because that causes us to lose focus on why Jesus remains a topic of conversation. This is just a thought experiment to consider. If I died tomorrow and resurrected 3 days later, it might make for an interesting event. Let's say I appeared to 200 or even 500 people. Eventually, though, it wouldn't matter. And the reason why it wouldn't matter is because I wouldn't leave any significant teachings behind. So at least some component of RHBS should account for why Jesus remains a topic of conversation. Jesus influenced Kierkegaard to create existentialism, George Bernard Shaw on socialism, Tolstoy, King, Gandhi on political nonviolence. So this is why the teachings of Jesus have hung around for as long as they have. I'll get to that more in the CTF argument. Now, there's also the phenomenological gap problem. I'm going to be pretty brief on this, but there are a lot of features in Christianity that are very hard to delineate. So even if you can say that Christian theology came about because of flawed beliefs, you still have to show that the phenomenological problems of the phenomenological features of the early proto-Christian community developed from those arguments as well. So we have like highly developed content, like the physical touching of Jesus, eating fish together, walking for miles down a road. And bereavement hallucinations are typically brief, fleeting glimpses, seeing the deceased in a crowd, hearing their voice momentarily, a brief scent. They don't include like an hour-long conversation. There's also the problem of behavioral transformation. The disciples' behavior changed dramatically. That seems difficult to explain. And there are many other phenomenological issues with Christianity that don't seem to be easily explained. Now, I'll just briefly touch upon the issue of shifting goalposts. I think RHBS in its current form does potentiate shifting goalposts, or at least a little bit of hand waving to a degree. In other words, we can substitute out reburial for theft. We can substitute out hallucinations for misremembrances. And I think it's strategically clever to do that, but I just want to create that as a signpost for some concerns. All right, now argument number 13 is the lack of applicability to theology. So theology, morality, and beauty seem to be evaluated by human thinking using, inferential reasoning rather than deductive reasoning. And a lot of other thinkers have advocated for this. So not all human decision-making is strictly deductive, and not all of it's based on smoking gun evidence. We pursue relationships, we move around the world, we choose college and occupational fields, all based on non-deductive decision-making. So RHBS may be solving a problem with the wrong set of tools, like looking at painting through a microscope. Similarly, there's also the problem of scalability of cognitive factors to societal processes. So I really applaud Dr. Fodor's multidisciplinary approach. It's really wonderful, but there's no evidence that these neuroscience and psychological insights actually scale up to the societal factors where the resurrection would take place, like bringing a fork to a knife fight is my example. Another example is the analogy of quantum computers. Quantum processes work very well at small quantum scales, but we can't really scale up the number of qubits because eventually the classic physics like effects predominate at emergent levels. And this is kind of the same that's true for RHBS. Now, I'll have to skip through these other slides much more quickly because, but just briefly, another issue is the fact that there is a multi-witness tradition in Judaism. So there's a lot of Jewish statements that say you have to have multiple witnesses. So I think this would sort of immunize the Jewish population against accepting the testimony for resurrection. There's the Nicodemus spice problem. Nicodemus brought a huge amount, thousands of dollars worth of spices, according to John 19:39. And I don't think he would have spent those spices on a body that he knew was being moved in 36 hours. There's the new tomb problem. All the synoptic gospels say that this was a new tomb, that it'd be kind of a waste to spend it on a body that would create a ritualistic tumamet impurity and just to move the body later. There's also the issue of Paul and James. I think if you look at Paul and also James, they had none of the features of RHBS. There's also the problem of the 40-day cutoff. The witness experience get cut off after 40 days. And then there's I'm going to skip over this last slide because I really want to get to my CTF argument as well, which is more of a affirming argument. So now I'm going to switch. And I think, let me pause my time here if that's okay. I think, Dr. Fodor, I think you need to get this to the screen. I'm not sure if I can. Let me see here. Okay, perfect. Thank you for doing that. Okay, and I will now resume. All right, so this is my comparative theological framework argument. Okay, it's convergent, comparative, and quantitative. So I try to underscore objective criteria. I'm using the evaluative criteria of basically a rational theistic gambler paradigm. So if you start from an objective standpoint with a theistic belief, then I think Jesus is the starting point with the most epistemic confidence. I'll review some of these arguments just briefly, and then hopefully we'll be able to get into the slides. But one of the arguments I look at in the CTF model is the weight of historical evidential argument based on the lag between miracle events and subsequent attestations. So I look at all religions, all miracle attestations of those religions, and then we show that the Christianity is the earliest. I also looked at, again, secular non-Christian events, and I compared the timing of Christian attestations to secular events that were widely agreed upon as having happened. Then I looked at the early attesting witnesses for each tradition, showing that there's more witnesses behind Christianity. I looked at the quantification. I tried to quantify the intellectual legacy left behind by each theological figure, and I looked at areas of consensus between theology. There's also minor elements as well. The fact that there was an itinerant teacher tradition, the fact that the early Christian apologists appealed to living witnesses, they were open to verification, there's historical grounding, name witnesses, counterproductive specificity, and a lot of other features that sort of would tend to make an objective observer think that if you had to place a bet on which religion was the most correct, you'd probably favor Christianity. All right, so let me get briefly to some of the graphs that I have here. So among ancient religions, Christianity has the witness attestations that are earlier, more robust, and more quickly repeated than any other tradition. For this, I looked at 153 data points. So 17 major world religions, 3 miracle traditions from each religion, 3 attestations for each religion. And so that gave me a total of 153 data points. Here's all the data points here. Hopefully you can see Christianity is down. It's down here somewhere. I don't know if you can even see my pointer. But here I've sort of delineated where Judaism is and where Christianity is. And these curves represent the best fit consideration. So you can see this is like, so each of these lines here has 3 dots. And those 3 dots represent the 3 attestations. And you can see Christianity is very, very clustered. Okay, Judaism is actually the theological belief system with the lowest Z-score. But this proves empirically, quantitatively, that the attestations for Christianity and Judaism are much, much earlier. If you rank Christianity by if you rank all the religions by their attestation gap, Christianity is the earliest among ancient religions. So there are religions that have earlier attestations, but they're all much, much more recent than Christianity. So I think that's significant. If you look at the gap between attestations, Christianity also ranks much more highly as the 4th on this list. So the point here is, and by the way, I've done this analysis in other ways. Here I'm looking at years from the religious text to the death, and I got very similar results for Christianity. And here I basically looked more at confidence intervals since primary and secondary attestations, and I showed that, again, Christianity is the only religion where both data points, the primary and secondary attestation, are below the confidence interval of what we would expect. So among ancient theological traditions, the evidence for Christianity is earlier, it's more robust, and more quickly repeated. A rational theistic gambler would likely use this as a criteria for gambling on Christianity. I also compared to other theological events, again, using my database of 32 events from 10 CE to 60 CE that have consensus among historical scholars as being real events. So the events in red here are the Christian attestations. Now, I did add some horizontal jitter just to sort of separate these lines apart from each other, but we can see that the attestations for Christianity did come relatively, within the expectations of what we would have for ancient religions. These are all the gaps. So Christianity is a little bit later. It's like 34 years to the first attestation. But if you look at other data points, that's really not a huge difference compared to all events and events that have other attestations. So when we compare Christianity to other events, I think at the very least, our rational theistic gambler would see that we don't have a late attestation for Christian miracle events. And the problem is this challenges the common contention that Christian resources are late and unreliable. I also quantified witness traditions among different religions. So for this part of the analysis, I looked at how many witnesses there are in the 12 major religions within the first 50 years, then the first 100 years, first 150 to first 200 years. So I looked at named figures, and I did this a lot of different ways. And Christianity, I should say, always comes up as first or second on this list. I'm not going to go through all the criteria just in the interest of time. But here, Christianity, you can see if you use a very strict criteria, Christianity comes second. It's tied for second with Buddhism, but second to the Latter-day Saints, which is a much more recent religion. So I think a rational theistic gambler would still have a high degree of epistemic confidence from this. Here, using a loose criteria, Christianity also comes in first, actually, in this, using more loose criteria. I also looked at quantification of historicity in each theological canon. So here what I did is I looked at each of these theological works and how many places. These are actually people. I mean, these are people that are verified in each canonical work, and these are places that are verified in each canonical work. So, and the total denominator here is right here. So, Okay, I'm sorry. Here's the places. Sorry. So again, Christianity, if you include the Old Testament and the New Testament, is orders of magnitude above any other religious work. So our rational theistic gambler would likely prefer religion with better historical grounding. It's probably relevant to note that this is particularly applicable in the era prior to religious hoaxes. Our first religious hoax that was grounded in actual events, that was a hoax, was many years after this, in the 8th century. So I also tried to quantify how unique and how relevant the teachings are of Jesus. I did this in a few different ways. There's some data on the screen that I hope you'll read, even though I'm kind of going fast at this point. But another thing that I did is I looked at the Reuters ISI Web of Science list of the 37 top cited scholars in 2007. And a lot of these scholars cited Jesus directly, and no other religious figures showed up. So these are 8 out of the 37 figures. These were non-apologetical sources, and they all cited Jesus in a way that was constructive, so not apologetical, and they referred to Jesus' teachings in a way that was positive and constructive, built on those teachings. This is Jürgen Habermas, just so everyone knows, it's not Gary Habermas. Anyways, and I looked at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They published the top 285 scholars in 2014. And again, Jesus shows up in 3.5% of the citations from these figures who are on the list of the top 285 scholars, and no other theological figures show up in the analysis. Now, there's a lot of other things that I don't really have time to go into because my time is up. But yeah, that's my time right there. But if Dr. Fodor would allow me just underscoring one additional point, even though this has been kind of a critical marshaling of a lot of examples against RHBS, I do have a great deal of admiration for his contribution and for the model. And I think hopefully at the end of the conversation, I'll hopefully be able to complement the RHBS model in other ways. All right, so that goes to 20 minutes. I hope that wasn't too long for people, and I hope to be able to get to some of the other arguments in my later presentations. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for hearing that out.
Cool. Thanks very much. I'll start on my rebuttal. Let me just.
And if you want to add any questions, like if there's anything you want to ask, I think we didn't put any time for like cross-examination or any questions, but feel free to.
We can do that in the discussion, I think.
Okay. Sounds great.
Well suited for that. What was I saying? Okay. Yes. My rebuttal. Let me just pull up my slides, and then I will. Start my timer. So it's 10 minutes, yes. Okay, thanks very much, Tavo. So I am going to be just addressing some of the points made in Tavo's opening remarks. I think I'll mostly focus on the first half where he presented some concerns about the RHBS model, and I'll also say a little bit about the resurrection hypothesis. So the two halves of Tavo's remarks, I think the first can be seen as a rebuttal to the RHBS, and the second can be seen as an attempt to present a positive case for why we should think that Christianity is true, I guess. I think it was slightly unclear what the conclusion is that we're supposed to draw from that, but I'll take that to be a conclusion that Jesus was actually resurrected as relevant to the topic of the debate. So first I want to outline some of the reasons why I think that I'm not showing my slides. What happened to that? I thought I added these. First, I want to share some reasons as to why I think that the resurrection hypothesis is not a very good explanation. Those appearing now? Yes, good. And this is relevant to one of Tavo's initial remarks, was that it is, he claims that it's fallacious to accept one explanation just because you reject a different explanation. And I mean, I think this is pretty clearly wrong if we're assessing explanations on probabilistic grounds. So if we think that one explanation is much more likely than another, or let's say we think one explanation is more likely than any other candidate, then it's reasonable enough to tentatively accept that explanation, or at least to grant a certain amount of credence to that explanation, even if that explanation is very unlikely. Because what we're doing here is a contrastive exercise in evaluating explanations on their explanatory scope, power, and plausibility. That doesn't say anything about how plausible or how good the explanation has to be in an absolute sense. And I think that this is a very important factor to consider here. So the resurrection hypothesis says something like that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. God raised Jesus from the dead as a culmination and of his salvific mission to mankind. And the risen Jesus then appeared to his followers as a vindication and proof of that status. And that based on the experiences that the disciples had in having Jesus appear to them and interact with them, the disciples then believed and began to preach his teachings and preach about the resurrection. So some of these criteria here will, I think, be relevant to Tavo's second half of his remarks, and we can discuss those. But I think that there are good reasons to think that Jesus probably was not a special divine messenger, particularly like the definitive divine messenger, which Christianity claims. It's sort of unclear why the divine messenger would be born so long into recorded history. And also, it's unclear why we should distinguish Jesus from the many other divine messengers or Messiah claimants, avatars, Buddhas claimants, or others who have been known to exist historically, and also many others who have been lost to history or are not familiar to the West. Now, Tavo did talk about the fact that Jesus is very well, his teachings are widely discussed and widely published and are reported more often than many other figures. I find this a very odd remark, particularly in the light of his earlier criticism about the potential biases and publication issues in the cognitive science regarding cognitive biases, because this is always a concern about how representative and how appropriate the literature is in considering different candidate explanations or different research agendas. But it seems clear here that just taking a sample of figures who are represented in English language materials or even just web-based materials is not really going to tell you much of anything about how influential that figure has been like across all of human history, because we're looking at a very particular subset that's very historically contingent of which figures end up being most influential based on which civilizations end up being influential culturally and historically and things like that. I just don't really understand how the number of references or citations is informative at all. There's another point which any of these sorts of analyses needs to consider, is that the special messenger could be thousands of years in the future. After all, Jesus could come 3,000 years into recorded history. Why not 10,000 years? So we need to consider all of the future candidates as well that could potentially exist. And so I just don't think it's on the prior plausibility that Jesus was a special divine messenger on the basis of these considerations is very high. There's some other factors there, which I'll just skip over. There's also the concern that Jesus probably wasn't the Jewish Messiah. The Messiah was understood to be a special envoy of God and a savior of the Jewish people. The Messiah was supposed to be a literal paternal descendant of King David. Jesus could not have been that according to Christian theology if he was in fact the Son of God and had no earthly father. Jesus also did not fulfill a variety of criteria that are generally understood by Jews then and now, not universally, but in large numbers, as something that the Messiah would do, such as gathering all Jews to the land of Israel, ushering in world peace, spreading universal knowledge of the God of Israel. Jews then and now have also argued that worship of Jesus is contrary to Jewish rejection of idolatry and contrary to Jewish doctrine that God is one. And as N.T. Wright and other apologists have themselves argued, there's simply no expectation that a Messiah would be crucified and die and then resurrected. That was a later theological development, which I argue was precisely in order to account for the fact that the disciples' expectation was dashed, that they developed this novel theological conceptions. There's also concerns that I have about the nature of the postmortem vindication of Jesus to his disciples. Jesus only appeared to his followers in and around Jerusalem for a few weeks. That is not what I would expect a divine figure who is supposedly vindicating their status to all of humanity. There's no appearances to people anywhere else, not in Jerusalem, apart from maybe the 500, but it's sort of unclear who those were. But other than that, there's no other appearances reported. They didn't appear to the Roman Senate, the Chinese court, ancient Americans, like the Mormons believe. I mean, unless you believe that, that's the end of those slides. So again, on the basis of these considerations, I think that the resurrection hypothesis is very implausible. Now, stepping back and contrasting the different explanations, we have to acknowledge here that what we're doing is trying to account for a specific historical event or series of related events. Any explanation of a specific historical event is going to be highly contextual and specific and probably highly unlikely on its own terms, because historical events are unique occurrences. They require a variety of factors in order to develop in the way that they do. This is why I think that Tavo's criticisms on the basis of the plausibility of the RHBS model missed the mark. He argued that 15 agents would have to act in a precise chronological order in order to make the RHBS model work, and that it requires, I think he said, 15 to 40 independent auxiliary hypotheses. I'm not sure exactly what all of those are. But the idea here is that there's many different pieces that have to fit together in a certain way. But that's just how history works. Like any historical event of sufficient complexity will have many different actors and many different parts to it. I don't really understand how that's an objection to anything. In order to explain a historical event, we need to explain the different component parts. We need to introduce hypotheses about how different agents acted and how their actions affected each other. The question is how plausible and how plausible are those postulates, and how strong is the explanatory scope and power of that explanation? And I think that's really what Tavo's objections don't really address. Simply pointing out that there's many different pieces, it doesn't really assess this at all. Tavo also mentioned that applying the criteria of the RHBS model to other historical events would lead those events to be rejected. But I'm not really sure why we should think that, or why that's the case. So maybe that's something we can discuss more in the discussion, because it's difficult to just respond to that without looking at detailed examples. But remember that I say specifically that the RHBS model identifies relevant considerations that mean that the bereavement hallucinations and the memory contamination and cognitive dissonance would all likely be operative in that specific scenario. Now, that they could also be operative in other scenarios, and I think that they were, but you need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. It really depends on the event you're looking at to explain. Now, in addition to criticizing the plausibility of RHBS, Tavo also criticized the explanatory scope of the RHBS model. He said that it can't explain the conversion of James and Paul. I agree. In the case of Paul, at least. Paul is certainly not a witness to the resurrection. He wasn't a follower of Jesus beforehand. But the resurrection hypothesis doesn't explain the conversion of Paul either. You need to introduce an auxiliary hypothesis of an additional appearance to someone who wasn't connected to Jesus. So I don't see this as a convincing rebuttal to the RHBS model. Tavo also said that the disciples' behavior changed dramatically, which can't be explained. I don't actually understand why that can't be explained. I think the RHBS model explains exactly why their behavior changed, because they came to believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. So I'm not sure what that objection is directed to. And he also said that the RHBS should explain why Jesus is still influential. But once again, that seems to be outside the scope. The RHBS model only seeks to explain how the disciples came to believe that Jesus had been resurrected from the dead. Once they believe that, then everything else is parallel, it seems to me, between the resurrection hypothesis and the RHBS model. I mean, you could argue perhaps that Christianity needed a divine guidance to succeed historically, or to grow into a world religion, but that's a separate argument. The RHBS model is not required to explain all of that. And the resurrection hypothesis doesn't explain that either. You need to introduce auxiliary hypotheses there. Finally, let me just comment on explanatory power, because a couple of Tavo's remarks also critiqued the explanatory power of the RHBS model. He said, for example, that I needed to show that the specific mechanisms that I cite apply particularly in the resurrection case, and also that I hadn't applied RHBS to look at other cases, only the resurrection case. I think that these are just red herrings. In order to explain one historical event, you don't need to explain other historical events, nor do I need to somehow prove that the mechanisms that I cite definitely did or likely did happen in the individual cases. There's no actual way to do that for any historical event. All you can do is construct an explanation and demonstrate how that explanation would account for the facts if true, and then establish the plausibility of the postulates that you introduced as part of that explanation. That's all you can ever do for historical events. So I don't really know exactly what Tavo wants me to do. And it's also important to bear in mind that the contrasting case asks us to believe that a divine figure who transcends time and space intervened in order to produce a one-of-a-kind miracle. So I don't know how you can establish that that specifically happened if we're going to apply the same standards for RHBS and the resurrection hypothesis. So I'll leave that there. Thanks very much, and I'll pass back to Tavo for his rebuttal.
And maybe just quickly a question. Can you clarify what you're saying about the auxiliary hypotheses in their application to Paul? You said something earlier about something Paul auxiliary. I was trying to take notes pretty quickly.
I think those were different points, but perhaps we can clarify this in the discussion.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And then how much time do I have for this rebuttal?
Well, I went for 11, so you can go for 11.
All right, so I first want to address the issue of relevance. How is the CTF model relevant to the theology of the resurrection specifically? So the CTF model is definitely an argument for a theology based on Jesus. What I'm saying is, if you're in an objective state, you would choose a theology based on Jesus. Now, I didn't get to all the reasons behind the CTF model, and if I have some time at the end, I'll probably get to that. But the point is that if you are an objective observer and you have to make a bet on which religion seems the most justified in that situation. If you're theistic, and let's assume you don't have any other subjective preferences, then the decision you would make would choose a theology based on Jesus. Now, I think you could make the argument that that doesn't necessarily prove that you have to accept the resurrection, but I would make the counter argument that the resurrection is so central to the theology of Jesus that accepting one assumes that you're going to accept the other. And I think if you say, well, I believe that Jesus was likely divine or had some divine authority, but I don't believe in the resurrection, then that can be a more fraught conclusion. Now, I do think that if you're walking away from this debate with that set of with that understanding, I think that's not something that I would consider to be a bad outcome. But I'm fine going on from there. So that's the relevance. There were some questions in the chat about resources, because I know I went through those slides all very quickly. So I'll just address that quickly. I will try to find a place to host this PowerPoint, and I'm happy to send it to James as well. So James, if you want to see these files later, I'll try and find somebody or someone who can host these. So keep an eye open for that post. All right, let's get to the issue of why is the divine messenger so late. So, I mean, I think to me this lines up perfectly with what I would accept from divine hiddenness. If Jesus had come, 10 decades ago, for instance, then we would be in the full throes of an era of literacy where there would be so much overwhelming documentation of what happened with Jesus. Like, let's say if Jesus came in the 1960s and resurrected in the 1960s, then it would almost be so epistemically clear that Jesus had resurrected that there wouldn't be as much of an openness to that kind of escape hatch. So to me, an RHBS style escape hatch through intellectual contortions is exactly what I would expect from that model. So that to me is sort of aligned with the divine messenger coming so late. Now, there's also other reasons that you could postulate, provided that you believe that there's an association between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I think that gap of several centuries between the two resources is also an important predictor of the messages of Jesus. I think you have a really good point when you say that all my citations of the Occidental literature are essentially somewhat culturally biased. If anyone has any suggestions of how I could repeat that analysis to mitigate that cultural bias, I'd be happy to do that. I don't think, though, that invalidates the argument. I think there's a bit of a genetic fallacy that if you say that all my arguments are flawed because I'm using these Western Occidental resources, then I still don't think that mutes the argument. I think, if anything, that does introduce a contention of bias. But the reasons why I think the bias is mitigated and the argument for bias is mitigated is because, number one, Paul doesn't show up in any of these lists. So anytime I look, so there is a lot of citations that of Jesus, of the teachings of Jesus. Again, those citations are constructive. And again, Paul doesn't show up anywhere, and no other theological figures show up anywhere. So I think there's a strong argument still to be made, even if there's a contention of bias. Now, the other important point is that Occidental literature is heavily secularized. So I think the fact that we see still, even to this century, into the last few decades, even in postmodern era, we still see a lot of scholars citing Jesus, speaks to the strength of the teachings of Jesus, that even in a postmodern era, which heavily overemphasizes secularism, we still see the teachings of Jesus still being cited. So that, to me, is why that makes the argument less flawed and less susceptible to bias. Moreover, I think we're citing scholars here. A lot of these people are atheistic scholars. So these are not people who would be predisposed to using Christianity specifically. And also another important point here is that I think I have some other thoughts on this that I've kind of written down, and hopefully we'll get to those in discussion, because sometimes I'm having trouble reading my own handwriting. All right. So here's the next contention that you had is that the special messenger, the divine messenger, could be later in history. Now, the problem is that with that is there's no way to refute that. So you're right. There could be a messenger who comes later in history. But I think from the standpoint of the rational theistic gambler, we would start off from the perspective that that we would have to make the decision based on the best information that we have in front of us. That's what we're trying to do with our debate. So I could argue to you that Jesus did resurrect because there's a book that's going to prove Jesus' resurrection that comes out in the future. But that would be a meaningless contention. So in other words, I think you can't predicate your arguments based on hypothetical events that might come about in the future. You have to decide what you can do with the best information that you have at hand. I think that's advocated by the rational theistic gambler perspective. And moreover, I think it limits debate to sort of just say we have to keep in mind any possible counterfactual that might emerge in the future. All right. Now, the prophecy fulfillment issue is kind of interesting. I have some notes on that specifically. And I think that argument actually cuts in the other direction. And I know a lot of people will make the case that Jesus fulfilled prophecy, and just as many will make the case that Jesus did not fulfill prophecy. So that's a very fraught debate to get into. So what I'm going to do instead is focus on what we do know from this consensus of historical scholars, which is that we know that there was a narrowing, a purposeful exclusional narrowing of prophecies as they were interpreted, starting in the mid first century and extending onward. So the fact that all of the Jewish testimony about prophecy fulfillment had to be changed so significantly after the lifetime of Jesus, I think is an argument that cuts the other way. In other words, from a rational theistic gambler perspective, I think our predisposition would be that Jewish theological life would not have changed before and after the death of Jesus. And on the other hand, we see at least a lot of changes in the theology in Jewish theology. There's the Birkat Haminim that seemed to correlate with a lot of the changes in interpretation of Jewish messianic expectations. That was in around the year 85 to 90 CE. There's the fact that passages were aggressively reinterpreted, especially Isaiah 53, Psalms 110, and Daniel 9:24 through 27, and Isaiah 7:14. So these are all passages that we know were very much reinterpreted after the death of Jesus and after the early rise of Christianity. So Aquila's translational choices also underscore this. We know that the text was changed to from virgin to young woman, and that's maybe the most obvious example. And we also know there's a lot of other things that were suppressed in Jewish culture after that time. For instance, we know that First Enoch and 4 Ezra were essentially excluded from Jewish canon, but they were preserved by Christians. And that schism was probably driven by the fact that the Jews wanted to mitigate any testimonial statements from Jesus. So, all right, the next contention is that why did Jesus only appear to his followers? Why didn't he appear to the Roman Senate? Why didn't he appear in China? So I think that's an interesting contention. But again, if Jesus had appeared to the Roman Senate, I don't know that they would have had any context for saying, we now know who you are. And I think if you extend this argument, you could extend it potentially ad infinitum, right? You could say, well, why didn't Jesus just use his finger and write in the surface of the moon, I am Jesus, I am God, right? So you could continue that logic to a point that it would be absurd. And the reason why you can't do that, and the reason why you'd have to stop at least a certain point, is because of the existence of divine hiddenness. So divine hiddenness is essentially the reason why Jesus would have appeared to his followers, wouldn't have appeared to other people. Moreover, this is absolutely consistent with the theology that Jesus talks about throughout his journey with his own followers, right? The journey in the New Testament isn't about, you all have to believe that I am equivalent to God. That's not what Jesus' message is, right? Jesus' message is more frequently, who do you say that I am? All right, now, here's another argument that you mentioned, that historical events are unique. So there's no historical method that applies across events. So I'll have to look up if I can find some historical methods, but I think this is a huge concession. If you're saying that the RHBS model works really well for explaining the events around the resurrection, and it literally doesn't work for any other events in history, then you have a model that essentially only explains one event. So, I mean, I think that's a really huge methodological concession to my arguments. You're essentially like reversing the burden of proof, saying that now I not only have to disprove RHBS, but I have to disprove RHBS, for the resurrection specifically, not just disprove it in the general case. So it also makes the model untestable, right? Because now you're saying there's a historical methodology, but you can never test it again because it only applies to one event and one event only. Now, I think you could have factors, but if you only have an event that has, if you have a model that only explains one event, there's lots of historical models that explain more than one event. And and I think if you say there's a difference between whether or not you're saying that you can't explain any other event or you don't need to. So if you can't explain any other event, then there's an explanatory deficiency, and I think you're sort of rebranding a weakness as something that's not necessary for you to account for. So, all right, I only have 1 minute left. I do want to briefly get to the arguments about post-bereavement hallucinations and some of the other arguments that you brought up. I guess hopefully I'll be able to get to those in the next debate. But I guess one of the things I'll say about post-bereavement hallucinations is that we know that there's never been a post-bereavement hallucination that has resulted in a resurrection belief. We also know that that a lot of people who have had flawed perceptions of reality, like people who are schizophrenic who have post-bereavement hallucinations, even when there's impaired reality testing, those individuals never have a flawed belief. They never have a delusion. So it's important to sort of differentiate hallucinations from delusions. And it's also very important to sort of delineate that post-bereavement hallucinations never actually themselves result in a belief that a resurrection has occurred. And we have lots of examples of that. The last thing I'll just say briefly is that, well, that's it. That's my time. All right. And feel free to ask me any questions on anything I said, because I feel like my thoughts were just a little bit jumbled. And I did really want to get back to the other sources that you referenced, like Lange and Howren and Picking Cotton and Festinger.
Cool. Thanks very much. I will just, so I have 5 minutes. Let me just pull up my, oops, reset your timer. Let me just pull up my slides again. And I'll start, make sure I actually share them this time. That would be nice. There we go. All right. So thanks again, Tavo, for those comments. In my last series of rebuttal here, before we get into the discussion, I just want to make some further comments about what Tavo said, and then bring things together and sort of contrast the RHBS to the resurrection hypothesis. I've put a table on here which you can viewers can have a look at while I'm talking to give the sense of some of this. First of all, before getting to that, I want to just address some of the things Tavo just said here. A lot of the responses that Tavo made, for example, in explaining why Jesus didn't appear to more people around the world, or why he didn't appear more recently in history, appeal to the notion of divine hiddenness. Now, we'll obviously need to talk more about that in the discussion, but I find this very problematic. First of all, divine hiddenness is not something that is sort of generally accepted. I mean, it's an argument people make, but like, I don't regard that as something that one can just help oneself to without discussion or without providing an argument as to why we should accept that that is a feature of God. And in particular, even if we do accept some element of divine hiddenness as expected, it's quite problematic in the way that divine hiddenness can always be fine-tuned very precisely so that one predicts exactly the amount of evidence that one has, and not any more and not any less. Obviously, Tavo talked about how well attested Jesus' resurrection is in terms of the number of witnesses and the amount of time. But then when pressed on why it's not better attested, he argues, well, divine hiddenness would mean that we shouldn't expect it to be better attested. Something's very fishy is going on here when somehow the exact amount of evidence that we do see is predicted like precisely by the theory. That is not, I think, although Tavo has accused me of this, that is not what the RHBS model says. The RHBS model doesn't have this sort of parameter of divine hiddenness that can be just arbitrarily tuned to whatever evidence we actually see. So I think that this appeal to divine hiddenness is quite problematic here. Now, responding to the point about prophecies, I think that this will need to be discussed further. But the fundamental observation that I have is that Jesus's disciples, and as far as I know, no other Jews at the time, expected the Messiah to be crucified and then resurrected from the dead as vindication of his divine status, and also as sort of a salvific sacrifice for our sins, and for the rest of the resurrection of most of the rest of humanity to then take place later. All of those things are novel theological developments which were not expected of the Messiah, despite the fact that, yes, there were differences about exactly what people expected, and that those did change over time. That's not relevant to the point that what Christians said that Jesus did and how he operated theologically in a relationship to God doesn't fit at all with Jewish belief at the time. And that is strong evidence in favor of psychological processes serving cognitive dissonance. And I think strong evidence against the idea that Jesus really was a divine messenger and a special messenger of God. And just a brief note that the idea that Jewish understandings of the Messiah changed dramatically in the first century is really not surprising, given the events of the AD 70 and the destruction of the Second Temple. One would also need to compare how much they changed at other points in history in order to make a claim that somehow Jesus's appearance was a driver of that. But that's a fairly specific point. Now, let me comment about the broader historical methods here. The RHBS model is an attempt to explain a specific historical event. It appeals to general sociological and psychological processes, which I think can be applied to other events, but it itself does not explain any other event. I don't actually understand Tavo's objection to this here. If I'm attempting to explain why Hitler invaded Poland, or why any other specific historical event took place, like why a figure made a specific decision, and in the case of the RHBS model, why is it the disciples came to believe a certain thing, the explanation that you give is going to be specific to that person and that place. You may well and should appeal to general processes, things that we know about humans, as well as details from the time and the place. And some of those methods will be applicable in other cases, of course, but the details are only going to be specific to that case. Let me also point out that the resurrection hypothesis is extremely specific. Unlike the RHBS model, it does not appeal to any broader sociological, psychological, or other historical processes. It is completely just God did this because he had specific reasons to do this specific event at this specific time for this specific person, and no other event in history hitherto or in the future will ever compare to this. So if there's any explanation that is incomparable and can't be generalized, it's certainly the resurrection explanation and not the RHBS model. And I think I've highlighted these points in this sort of table here. Many of the elements are not really explained by the RHBS model. It's sort of taken for granted, or additional elements need to be introduced, such as divine hiddenness to explain why God didn't appear to more people, or why the prophecies don't fit. Whereas I think the RHBS model either explains these well, or at least plausibly. We can maybe come back to this table later because I didn't have as much time on it. But that exhausts my time. Thanks very much again, and I'll pass back to Tavo. And remove this.
All right. And again, let me just reset my timer. And how much time do I have for this part?
5.
All right, so there's a lot of things that we haven't addressed yet that I hope we'll get to in the comments, and I think we both echoed that. I'd be remiss if I didn't say during this my last chance to give a formal rebuttal that I am really grateful to Dr. Fodor for engaging me in this conversation. I think it's been really educational for me, and I hope that you all in the chat have in the audience have learned stuff, and I certainly have as well. But basically, we're kind of in an impasse here because what we have is we have two theories. We have the resurrection and RHBS that can only explain one event and one event only, and we seem to both be converging on this point. So if that's the case, then either this event is mundane or it's an outlier. And if you're saying this is an event that only happens once in history that can never be repeated, then that indicates to me that this is an event, that this event is an outlier, and therefore less likely to be explained by mundane events. Now, we have explanations for why Hitler invaded other countries. We have explanations for World War II. There's different mechanisms that come together that congeal to create those historical events. Each historical event is in and of itself unique, but every historical event can be predicted by certain factors. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is whether or not the factors are particularly relevant. Now, I want to go through some of my initial arguments and discuss the problems with RHBS that I outlined at the beginning that I think still haven't been addressed at this point. So we seem to all be converging on the idea that there's no historical verification of RHBS. In fact, it doesn't work. It compels us to reject events that actually happen. That shows us that in other events where we can apply RHBS, and we can apply it to other events, my argument is not it doesn't apply to other events, in which case I think a lot of your responses are quite a bit more persuasive. But what I've shown, and why I started my arguments with, and what was my very first argument, is that RHBS can indeed be applied to other situations. And when we apply it to other situations, it in fact doesn't work out. Now, there are a lot of things in my initial case that I don't think were addressed enough. And I just want to underscore at least some of those. There is the amplification of known biases. So we haven't really, all we have is biases from both sides. You have the individual biases, the witness biases. I have the biases that I cited from the scholarly literature. So it seems like we're at the very least at an impasse. We also have the unproven epistemic prior. We have the use of selective scriptural resources. These are at least steps that are fundamental to the RHBS model that aren't provided. This shows us at the very least that the model is incomplete. We have also the unobservable cascade of events. So in other words, we know that I started off the debate with the contention that the chances of RHBS actually playing out were about 1 in 8,000. That was probably a generous overestimate. We're still sort of in an impasse where we still have two unlikely conclusions waging war against each other. Now, if we are at that impasse, and I think the argument that I have is we go back to the CTF argument, and the CTF argument underscores that Jesus has credibility from our standpoint of the rational theistic gambler. So if you're from a theistic perspective, you would choose to believe in Jesus, and that would compel you to believe in the main aspect of the Jesus theology, which is the resurrection itself. What I'm showing in that argument is that the only way to get to RHBS as the ultimate conclusion is based on your metaphysical prior of being an atheist. So if you're not an atheist, once you leave that paradigm, you're back in the situation where you have to accept the CTF model and the arguments for Jesus. Now, there are a lot of other things in the CTF model that I hope we'll get to in the discussion, but there are I do want to talk more about divine hiddenness. I'm definitely not saying that that you can adjust it wherever you want. My point is that there's inference to the best explanation, which is an inferential and inductive reasoning process, and inference to the best explanation can lead us towards truth in a lot of areas. When we look at beauty, when we look at art, when we look at theology, there's other processes that come into account. But we would expect that if you have enough intellectual contortions, that you can get out of accepting that inferential explanation. Right now, there's the events around the death of Jesus and the birth of Christianity. Okay. And you can explain those events by looking at a lot of different actors and a lot of things that are inadequately attested, or we can assign the explanation for those events to things that we at least have some attestation for. So I've got a lot of attestations on my side, and there's at least a lot of conclusions in RHBS that are not yet attested. For instance, like the reburial hypothesis. So there's also the issue of the unfocused explanandum. I think that still hasn't been addressed. In other words, are you refuting religious beliefs in general, or does your argumentation apply to RHBS? There's also the issue of contextuality. I think you haven't sort of acknowledged that one of the reasons why Jesus persisted as a set of teachings is because Jesus was a compelling teacher for whatever reason. And we can trace that compulsion, the fact that Jesus has a lot of appeal as a teacher throughout history, even to our present day in the postmodern time. Now, the other question I want to ask you, and this is maybe a question for you and also for the audience, is at what point does an improbable explanation fail to become convincing of an atheistic or mundane hypothesis? Now, if the resurrection events are strictly mundane and they could be turned out by any set of events, any set of historical explanations, then we ought to have a lot of events that are just like the resurrection. I think if you followed the analysis of the CTF model, okay, that's my time there.
No, you can finish your sentence.
Well, if you follow the analysis of the CTF model, then it points out that at the very least, the theology behind Jesus is unique in that it stands out from other fields and from other religions. I could maybe be more inclined to buy RHBS if we looked at every religion and there was no discriminating features. But the fact that we have discriminating features in favor of the theology of Jesus, I think is something that in the final analysis is compelling.
Great. Thanks very much, Tavo. We mostly kept to time, so I think that format actually worked quite well. So now we have, excuse me. So now we have scheduled 30 minutes of discussion. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but we'll see how we go.
Now, just so I have a bit of an intellectual break, would you be okay if we addressed maybe a couple of questions from the audience, just so I can kind of have a bit of
Is there one that you had in mind?
No, I haven't kept an eye on the chat at all. So
actually, there was one directed to me from earlier, which I could respond to now because I did say that I would. I just have to find it. It was from a viewer who was asking about, yes, it was regarding the expectation that that the Messiah would appear in a, what's the word that they used? In a, oh geez, with more chat than I thought, that they thought that Jesus would appear in a, I'm trying to, I don't want to put words in their mouth. Glorious. Yeah, here it is. I found it. Yeah, that they've, Jews expected resurrected bodies to appear in a glorious form, or like a perfected form, and that contrasts with what allegedly the disciples say, or the Gospels say about Jesus's appearances, which was sort of ordinary and mundane. So this was from Real Seekers. I'll just show that up here. So I said that I would respond to that later. I just don't want to straw man here. So a quick response to that. So I think that what the Gospels present about Jesus' appearance is a bit contradictory. I've noted this in many people have noted this actually, because in some appearances he is not recognized at all and then disappears. And then in other cases he appears to be mundane in the sense that you can like touch his hands and he eats fish and things like that. But those seem to be sort of in contrast to each other. Like if he's appearing and disappearing, that doesn't indicate that he's like ordinary or mundane. but then in other contexts, if he's like eating, maybe it does, right? And I think that it's sort of unclear how to reconcile those exactly. They seem to be somewhat different understandings of the nature of resurrected Jesus. I'm not saying those are strictly contradictory, but there's also the point that, I mean, it's just the comments and notes that the expectation was that they would be in white robes and things like that. I mean, I don't think the Gospels say what Jesus was wearing. I think that the disciples likely did feel in his presence that he was a glorified being, because that's what they would have believed and expected about him, that there was something special about him, certainly, even if they didn't believe at that time necessarily that he was like the Son of God or something. So the point is, I don't really see any evidence in the gospel accounts to contradict the idea that a resurrected body would be glorious in some sense. I think that there's always been a tension in Christian teachings between thinking of Jesus as mundane, earthly, a human, and thinking of Jesus, on the other hand, as glorified, heavenly, divine, and that he's sort of both of those at the same time. And this has been played out, over centuries of theological disputes, and I think that you can see that in the Gospels as well. So I don't see any refutation there, as I guess my point. Feel free to respond to that, or you don't have to if.
No, I mean, I think this continues a motif that we have in several places in the Old Testament, where there's an interaction between someone who is divine and somebody who's earthly, right? When Jesus approaches his disciples or approaches Mary, there's an initial non-recognition motif, which you in many of your talks have really eloquently pointed out. Now, this does continue a motif that we see throughout the Old Testament. We have, I think, Abraham at Mamre, which I wrote down in Genesis 18, 1 through 15, where Abraham sees some angels, he sees some men standing in front of him, and he doesn't initially recognize them to be divine messengers, but then later on he does. There's also the fact that the angels appear to Lot when he is in the city of Sodom, and initially there's a problem of non-recognition. There's also Jacob at Peniel in Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32, where Jacob wrestles through a man throughout the night, and he doesn't realize that he's looking at a divine opponent initially. There's also Moses in the burning bush. There's initially an issue of non-recognition. There's also the issue of Gideon. Gideon speaks with a visitor, assuming he's just a normal individual, then realizes he's an angel. So the initial non-recognition of Jesus, I've actually asked this to a lot of Christians, because I don't particularly find a really adequate explanation for this, just to be honest with you. But I do think it does continue a motif of initial non-recognition of a divine entity that seems to at least happen recursively throughout the Old Testament. Good question.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that is a good question. Can I ask you a question now, or more to the point, ask you to elaborate on something that you mentioned, which I think is well placed to maybe begin the discussion with, and this is relates to the list of historical events that you emailed me before and that you mentioned and you showed in your slides, that the RHBS model would require, well, I think that you argued require us to reject the historicity of those events, or that they really happened. So I thought that this was an interesting approach, because some other people who've discussed with me have argued that the RHBS model would lead us to reject other sorts of events, but they haven't constructed a particular list or argued for a particular examples of this. So there are quite a lot of events on your list, but I thought maybe we could just either pick a couple, or you could talk about the general features of them, because I'm not sure I understand why the RHBS model would lead us to reject any other specific event. So would you like to develop that point a bit, and maybe we can make
sure. Let me look through my notes. That was the reason why I sent that argument to you in advance, but I definitely wanted to
yeah, well, I wanted to discuss it with you. To see how you develop that.
Let's look at the death of Herod Agrippa in 44 CE. So here's the claim. The claim is that Herod Agrippa the first died after being struck by an angel of the Lord in Acts 12:23. Josephus describes this as being struck by severe pain after accepting divine acclamation. So I looked at sort of an R parallel component and then an HBS. So the R parallel component was, is there a mundane alternative? So a mundane alternative here would be a natural illness, or like heart attack or something, versus superficial causation. The H component would be, does the crowd perceive divine judgment? And that's that results in supernatural attribution or an attribution of a natural death to a supernatural cause. So to me, there's sort of an H component there. Then there's the B component is their bias, and that's the retrospective theological interpretation. And this is the theological narrative that was shaped by the outcome of the death of Herod Agrippa I. And then there's the S component where Jewish and Jewish and Christian communities together reinforced the narrative that God struck down this individual. So he seems to meet all of the criteria of RHBS. So in other words, I think, and by the way, I did actually 2 rounds of this. So the first round was looking at using very liberal criteria of RHBS. And when I looked at that, I was like, you could really explain away almost all of these events as hallucinations. So even just taking the H model of RHBS, you could explain all these events as hallucinations. And then I tried to do it again with a much more conservative application. And using the conservative application, I think Herod Agrippa is probably the most poignant, but we could talk about Caligula's madness as well.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the thrust of what you're arguing for here, because what you've just explained seems all perfectly fine to me. That actually seems like a good application of the method that I use, and using just what I was saying before, taking the general processes and methodology of RHBS and then applying it to a different event. But why is that a problem for my argument? That's what I don't understand.
Because most historical scholars did agree that Herod Agrippa had a sudden death, right?
Well, but that's not what you just explained. You explained how an RHBS parallel could be developed for why it is stated that he was struck down by an angel, right? And I don't think most historians agree that he was struck down by an angel. So what is the problem with then adapting an RHBS style argument to explain why people came to believe that? That seems perfectly legitimate to me.
Well, I mean, that's fine. That's perfectly legitimate. But then you can't use the RHBS features that are there to reject the resurrection. In other words, we know the death of Herod Agrippa happened, right? And so,
but the RHBS analog would be explaining why people thought that it was by an angel. No, obviously, you're not going to dispute that he died. What's the problem?
Well, because there's an underlying event that happened, right? Which was
that he died. And it could be due to an illness, which was then understood in a certain way, just as you explained it, I think, very eloquently.
Maybe that's not the best.
What's the problem?
Well, the problem is this: we have if there's RHBS elements and the presence of those elements compel us to reject an event. You're saying we need to reject the resurrection of Jesus because of the RHBS elements that are in the resurrection of Jesus, right? So I don't accept that framing, right? So we shouldn't reject the resurrection of Jesus. That assumes that we are coming to the table already believing in the resurrection of Jesus, right? What we're coming to the table believing is a certain set of historical facts, right? And we could argue about exactly what we put in that basket of facts. You haven't disputed that. So I listed those at the outset. What we're then doing is comparing explanations for those historical facts. So we don't come to the table assuming that the resurrection happened and then asking whether we can reject it or not. We're putting on the table different contrasting explanations and then evaluating them on their explanatory merits. That's what I've been advocating for all evening, right? So that's what I'm saying that we're doing. Yeah, and I mean, from my perspective, there's attestations behind the resurrection. So RHBS serves to take those attestations and hold them in question because they have these certain features where they could be hallucinations. They could be
yes, that's right.
biases. They could be socialization. So the resurrection is the event, right? The RSBA.
No, the resurrection is an explanation of the facts. I mean, obviously, if you think that it's a true explanation, you think it was an event, right? But you can't just assert that it was an event as if that's a fact that I'm rejecting.
Let's treat it as a hypothetical event. So when I say event, I mean
a postulated event, just like the processes that I talk about.
We have some attestations for it. So you're saying that if it has these features, we can say that it didn't actually happen.
The resurrection, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, that's why can you not say that with all the other events that I listed from between 10 CE and 60?
That's why I was asking you for an example so that I could see what the parallel was. Now, let me then respond maybe to a concern here. One could say that almost anything was a hallucination, right? But the question is how plausible that is given the context and given contrasting explanations. This is why I said that it's always an issue with comparing different explanations, because I think I said before the resurrection. The facts surrounding the resurrection, the post-mortem appearances and whatnot. I think I've said this before. It was an unusual event, right? It was unusual in a number of ways. It wasn't what people expected, and I think it was an unusual confluence of factors like the empty tomb and then the combined with the beliefs about the Messiah and other things like that. So the RHBS model is not going to say that that combination of events had high probability, like antecedently. And I don't need to say that, because what I'm trying to do is account for the facts in a plausible way. Only if an alternative explanation can provide a more plausible and more explanatory explanation does the fact that the RHBS model render its judgment as these events are relatively implausible. Only then does it become a problem. In other words, it's always contrastive. I agree that the RHBS model is in some sense low probability. I mean, you showed a quote from me in one of your slides where I said that, but that's not a problem unless an alternative explanation can be shown to have a better explanation or render it more plausible given its background assumptions. So that's relevant to when we're assessing other historical events, because an RHBS style argument may not be a very good explanation in those cases because there are better explanations on the table. So obviously it's a case by case as to whether the relevant factors, like how explanatory are they, how plausible are they in that particular case, and then you weigh the different explanations that are proffered against each other. So unless I can be given a case that I think clearly shows an RHBS parallel that gives us the wrong judgment, I'm not sure I see a problem here.
Yeah, let me try and contextualize this in a little bit of a different way. So first of all, if there's no other information and you just tell me that, look, somebody died 2,000 years ago, and then there's here's like 8 different letters that I found from people saying that he resurrected. Do you believe he resurrected with no other evidence? I would say that's very confusing, but it's not theologically impactful on my life, right? Let's say you knocked on my door and you said, look, I'm telling you, Joseph Smith resurrected. Here's 12 different letters from people who were signed affidavits saying that he indeed resurrected. I mean, I have already read the Book of Mormon, you know, so I would say, again, it's not that relevant. It goes back to my thought experiment. What if I resurrected tomorrow and appeared to 12 or even to 500 people? It wouldn't matter at all. So again, I think that if you hyper focus on the resurrection itself, an event, and you don't include anything else, then it becomes sort of a meaningless question. Now, if you just had that as a thought experiment and you came to me and you said, well, I think there was this event probably came to be from biases and stuff, I would probably say that absent the factors in the CTF argument, that I would be inclined to believe that there's probably some confabulation that led to this mistaken belief that somebody had resurrected when they actually probably hadn't. So to me, the argument that pushes me in the other direction is the CTF argument, right? And again, that's the reason why the debate is relevant. That's the reason why there's context. If you just said somebody resurrected 2,000 years ago, it doesn't really matter that much. I think that's the starting point of RHBS. Now, the other point, though, that I want to emphasize is this. I think, number one, your analysis for why the RHBS happened is based on interesting cognitive factors, but I don't know that those cognitive factors are persuasive to me for people developing a false belief in the resurrection based on the other things that I've seen. And I read your sources, Lange and Haran and Festinger and Picking-Conton and Granhag and Stormwall and Billings. Like, I read several of those resources, and I think they're really explanatory of having false religious beliefs, but I don't know that they explain the belief in the resurrection specifically. So I guess what I'm saying here is to me, the RHBS does do a good job of casting skepticism on the contention that, you know, you argue persuasively that religious beliefs can emerge without an explanation, or with these other cognitive factors as the explanation. So I think that you argue towards skepticism. And one of my slides that I actually put up that I kind of flipped through quite quickly is you argue for skepticism, but the point is you don't tell us what the threshold is for rejection, right? So at some point,
I just don't. Sorry to interrupt, but I don't agree with the way that you're framing this. You say, I argue for skepticism, but I don't tell what the threshold is for rejection. What do you mean skepticism and rejection? I completely reject that framework, right? I'm not starting from the idea that we should believe, or that we started to believe, or that we thought we should believe in the resurrection, and then we have to reach some threshold of skepticism or evidence. I'm saying, here's a set of facts. What is the best explanation for those facts? Assessing plausibility, scope, and explanatory power. And I want to know why the resurrection does better than RHBS. It's not an issue of like thresholds or skepticism or anything like that. I just don't see that's relevant to anything that I've argued.
Well, the reason why I cast it as skepticism is because you're telling us that religious beliefs can originate from.
I'm skeptical of certain theological claims, sure, but you're skeptical of lots of other theological claims. Everyone's skeptical of lots of things. So yes, you can cast what I'm doing as skeptical. I'm not going to refute that label. It's just that I'm trying to bring back to what I'm setting out to do, bring us back to what I'm setting out to do, which is assess different explanations for a certain set of facts. And I don't need to establish some sort of threshold for when we go from belief to skepticism or skepticism to belief. That's nothing to do with it. What we need to assess is which explanation does better on these criteria.
I see what you're saying, but I would disagree with that. And the reason why I would disagree is I think you need to have an evaluative criteria, right? If you're just saying,
well, you do. It's explanatory scope, power, and plausibility, right? That's the criteria.
Well, yeah, but yeah, and the reason why I say the explanatory scope fails is because after looking at these resources, I feel like they don't provide explanations, right? What they do is they argue for skepticism. When I read
what is the difference? I don't understand what you're saying there. You're saying you don't believe in my explanation. Okay, that's fine. You don't have to, but you don't explain why. You just says because it's not a good explanation.
Let's look at and we can go through some of these. All right, so let's look at Lange and Haran, that source, right? So they looked at kind of selective attention and the way these selective attention can give rise to beliefs, but what they looked at several things, and you have to have ambiguous stimuli in their model, right? So you have to. So in other words, if that's your model for explaining the resurrection, then if there's no ambiguous stimuli that persisted, or at least if you have to explain where that stimulus came from, right? They also said that the accepting of a suggestion requires to prime the audience, right? So the audience has to be primed to generate that process of selective attention. Yes, there's also the fact that they have to be in a shared environment when where they're all exposed to the contagion, right? Their perceptual contagion together. They also admit that there's still, even if you combine all those things, there's still an explanatory gap where sometimes people won't have a false belief and sometimes they do. And they admit, so when I take your resources and I put them in a big pile, I think they're all persuasive taken together. I don't think they add sufficient explanation for why you can have a resurrection belief.
Well, hang on. That's a very general conclusion from a specific example. Why don't we discuss that example just a little bit, right? So sure. That's one of the studies that I cite talks about how you can stick people in a sensory deprivation chamber and just give a very mild suggestion that they may experience something funny and that or something strange or unusual, and they'll report, many people, not everyone, many people will report all sorts of different things. So there does need to be a suggestion involved here that clearly, or expectation, I should say, that's clearly present in the case of the disciples, right? It's the empty tomb plus the bereavement hallucinations plus trying to make sense of why Jesus was crucified. So I don't know how I don't think you can plausibly argue that there was no expectation that something would happen, that something would resolve their concerns, that they would experience something. I don't understand how you can say that wasn't present.
Well, let's stick with the experimental setting then, right? So you're saying that you can create out of nothing, essentially ex nihilo, because they didn't have any stimulus other than the mild.
That's just one example. Obviously, in other cases they create an ordinary house and they just tell people it might be haunted or you might experience something strange, and then people report all sorts of things consistent with that context. So it depends on the context.
I have notes on all these sources. So which was the haunted experiment?
I don't have the citation off the top of my head.
Okay.
I'd have to check.
Well, I mean, so that's the problem. When I dug into these sources, they don't share enough features of the resurrection environment to.
What feature is missing? So we've got the expectation, we've got the group context, and we've got.
Lange and Heron do say that you have to have an external stimulus, and it has to be ambiguous.
Well, so we're bombarded with external stimuli all the time. It could be literally anything that the disciples experienced while they were praying and discussing with each other. I don't really understand what the problem is.
That's the problem. If you say it could be anything, then you're back in the category of just hand waving.
No. How is that hand waving? I obviously don't know. You're asking me to say what exact external stimulus was the initial trigger for self-reinforcing attentional processes of the disciples in their Jerusalem room 2,000 years ago. That is a ridiculous criteria that no one can satisfy for almost any historical event. Now, bear in mind that the contrasting explanation here that you're advocating for is God did it, right? Why do I have to go into all of this detail and you can just say God did it for reasons that are not even specified? Like I just don't understand how you can demand that extreme level of detail on my hand and then on the other hand not provide any detail at all.
Yeah, and the reason why I can do that, the reason why I justify that is because of the CTF argument. Now, I admit that if you're in a paradigm that is very entrenched by atheism, the CTF argument doesn't work for you, right? I'm assuming a rational.
My model does not assume atheism. In fact, it assumes theism.
Well, but that's the problem. That's where the CTF argument comes in. Let's say you start from a theistic worldview, then you follow the CTF argument and you come up with a theology based on Jesus, based on the argumentation in the CTF model, which I've done a whole video on the CTF model. And I recommend people check that out if you're not, because I only presented some of those arguments. But there's a lot of other arguments. For instance, one of the things that I pointed out in the CTF model is that every religion points towards Jesus, right? So, we have Swami Vivekananda was a great Hindu thinker, very well respected, who said that if he had seen Jesus in first century Judea, he would have washed the feet of Jesus, not with, scented oils, but with the blood of his own heart. We have
sorry, who said that? I just missed what.
Swami Vivekananda. He was a great Hindu thinker who brought yoga to the West. Gandhi said the same, very similar statements of quite, very passionate admiration for the Sermon on the Mount, saying that if he just had the Bhagavad Gita and the Sermon on the Mount, if he lost the Bhagavad Gita and he just had the Sermon on the Mount, he would just be as nourished. And this is coming from a Hindu thinker who is very, very much conditioned to dislike Christianity. So my point is this: is if you're starting off in a theistic paradigm, then my CTF argument brings you to a point where you should accept a theology based on Jesus, right? And so I think you can stick with an RHBS model, but in order to do that, I think in order to justify it based on the contentions that I've laid out in the CTF argument, you have to stick with an atheistic paradigm. I think once you leave atheism, once you admit theism, then my CTF argument brings you to the theology of Jesus, and that suggests that if the scale, and look, I would be more inclined to accept RHBS if there were other events where RHBS did pan out and gave us exactly the same thing.
But you gave an example yourself. I thought that was a really good example.
Yeah, but it's an example where historians think that these things actually happen.
No, historians don't think that Herod was killed by an angel. I don't understand why you're saying that.
I mean, and I mean, maybe I didn't articulate that well, but my point with all 32 events is when there are RHBS features, if you say if there are, and maybe this is not the way you intend the argument to be framed, but my standpoint is this: there's 32 different events that have happened. Let's look at 16 of them and throw them out, okay? And we're going to throw them out based on the criteria of if they have RHBS features, right? So if your argument is that's not how it works, it only applies to the resurrection, then my contention is going to be, well, that's at least somewhat flawed, because you're saying that, I have this set of arguments, it only works in one setting and one setting alone. And I think if that's your standpoint, I think it seems flawed to just say, I have this argument, it works really well for the resurrection, it doesn't work in any other context.
But it's not an argument, it's an explanation which is designed to explain a certain set of facts, which the resurrection also explains those set of facts. I don't understand why it being specific to those facts is somehow a weakness. It would only be if the resurrection explains a broader range of facts.
Let me pose this to you in another way, using your own evidence that you've pointed out, which I think is all really beautiful. It's a very persuasive case, and I think it's rhetorically particularly persuasive. But in what experimental setting, based on your studies, what stimuli would you need to use to convince somebody that somebody had resurrected from death?
I don't understand what you're asking. There's no specific set of stimuli that alone convinces someone, and that's not part of the RHBS model. I never said that a specific stimulus convinced anyone, like a stimulus in an experimental setting. That's the way you framed it. I never say that a specific stimulus that could be replicated in an experimental setting convinced anyone that Jesus was resurrected. I don't say that.
But based on, well, then I guess my question is this: then it comes back to the unfocused explanandum problem, where you have this canopy, and you're saying there's a religious belief under the canopy that's false. How do I know that religious belief under the canopy is Christianity? How do I know that that's the resurrection? In other words, if I look at all your evidence, I think your evidence points toward in the direction of skepticism. You're saying religious, beliefs can emerge through, there's false memories, there's selective attention processes. These things can all give rise to false beliefs. But I guess the question then is still,
everyone believes that, as far as I know. Do you deny that? Do you deny that hallucinations and selective memory and things can give rise to false beliefs? Because I think there's a mountain of evidence that contradicts that. You might not agree with every specific example, sure, but I don't think you can disagree with the broad point.
Yeah, I mean, I would deny that hallucinations will give rise to a belief system that is antithetical to our pre-existing belief system. And there's psychiatric resources who have voiced this perspective that when we have hallucinations, those hallucinations are congruent with our pre-existing beliefs.
Well, yes, but then there's also cognitive dissonance to be factored in, and I argue that it makes perfect sense of what the disciples came to believe, that what they experienced was congruent up to the point that it could be, and changed in ways that it was necessary to account for the disconfirming evidence. So I don't see that.
What about James's cognitive dissonance? Paul's cognitive dissonance?
What about it? Well, let's focus on one at a time. Which do you want to discuss?
Paul.
Okay. I have no idea why Paul converted. The RHBS model doesn't say anything about Paul. What's your explanation for how Paul converted? Or what's the resurrection explanation for how Paul converted? Let's contrast that, because I don't have one, right? I'm not presenting anything. What's the resurrection explanation?
Jesus was divine and appeared to Paul.
So that's an ad hoc postulate that he appeared to Paul. So I'm allowed to then make an ad hoc postulate?
Yeah, here's why it's not an ad hoc postulate, because all I need is a divine powered entity in the mechanism to explain everything.
No, that's obviously wrong, because Muslims don't believe that Jesus appeared to Paul, and they believe in a divine entity. You don't just need a divine entity. You need a specific postulate about the desires or motivations of that divine entity, and that's ad hoc. Why would Jesus appear to Paul instead of anyone else?
You were saying there's a divine agency.
Because you have no prior reason to believe that the divine entity would do any such thing. Why would he appear to Paul? Where does that come from, the assumption that Jesus was the Messiah and was resurrected? How does that lead to he appears to Paul? Explain the connection to me.
Okay, so to me, Jesus was, if we have, okay, let's start with the endpoint of the CTF argument, right? So we're starting from the perspective that we're in the rational theistic gambler paradigm, and we've admitted that Jesus was likely divine, right? Okay, so if Jesus had divine authority, he ought to have been able to appear to people who would further advance his agenda, right? So how is that? And I could say,
but you haven't explained why he appears to Paul. I'm still waiting for that to be included.
Well, I don't know.
What you said is that he could appear to Paul, but why would he? Because he could have appeared to the Roman emperor, who could have then converted to Christianity in the first century instead of the third century.
His incentivization of appearing to Paul is because Paul had an antagonistic set of beliefs.
Well, so did lots of other people. Why Paul specifically? And why would that be a good reason? Why wouldn't it be better to appear to people who already believed, which is what he did previously? Because previously you argued that he would appear to his disciples because of divine hiddenness, but now he's appearing to someone who didn't believe him because he had a reason to do this.
What I'm saying is that's not an ad hoc hypothesis. It
is ad hoc. You haven't given any reason. All you've said is that he could have appeared to Paul, which I grant, but you haven't said why he would or why we would expect that, antecedent to introducing specific hypotheses about why he would specifically appear to Paul. There's just nothing in the theory that would predict this.
Well, I mean, Paul was a persecutor of Jews, so appearing to Paul.
So why would he appeal to a persecutor of Jews?
Because to enhance his case about. To
enhance his case to whom? It didn't seem to work for the Jews. And anyway, there's plenty of other people that were much better.
It did work quite well for the Jews. The largest.
What are you talking about? How many Jews converted? Not very many.
The largest mass exodus of Jews from Judaism, and this is after something like 650 years of Jewish persecution and attempted conversion efforts, with eight different kings and leaders who had power over the Jews, and I can list them off. But the largest mass, all those efforts were all of 8 different kings tried to convert Jews to their religion. They all failed, right? And so
what's that got to do with Paul?
Because you're saying that it wasn't enough to convince the Jews, and in fact, and I would argue the contrary.
He didn't.
But the biggest mass exodus of Jews from Judaism was actually the conversion from Judaism to proto-Christianity. This is the biggest mass exodus.
I don't know where you're getting that from, but even if that's true, the vast majority of Jews did not convert to early Christianity. It was largely a Gentile movement. And this is all beside the point, because it still doesn't explain why we would expect Jesus to work in that particular way. He could have done anything. He could have appeared to the governance all around the world. Okay, let me say this in a different way. You said before that Jesus's purpose was not necessarily to convince everyone, but it was rather to, I just want to get the quote here. It was something about, who do you say that I am, right? Jesus' message was, whom do you say that I am? Now, my question to this is, the vast majority of people throughout history had nothing to say to that because they didn't know anything about Jesus. So if that's Jesus's purpose, is to get people to think about or to ponder that question, he didn't do a very good job because most people didn't know anything about him until relatively recently.
Yeah, so
it just doesn't make sense. It's not what you expect.
So let me give you an easy way out of that, okay? We're just born with a genetic memory that we all know the New Testament by heart at birth, right? That would get you out of that situation. Right. The problem is
one way. Yeah.
I think it's the only way. I think it's the only way, because otherwise you have to say, well, Jesus didn't spread his ideas to enough people.
Well, he didn't. He clearly didn't. If you assume that his purpose is to vindicate his special divine status to all of mankind, which is, I understand, what Christians say his purpose was, they didn't do a very good job.
Yeah, and I would argue that he did, right? Because
Well, what about all the people who didn't know anything about him and still don't in many places, but certainly historically?
Well, it's a valid conundrum, and Christian theologians have addressed that better than I would. But I could give you like an explanation, which is, we know that people existed before Jesus. We're assuming.
Yeah, well, I mentioned that as well.
Yeah. And we also know that people exist today who don't know anything about Jesus, who will never hear the name Jesus, who will never know anything about the New Testament. That doesn't necessarily prove that the theology in the New Testament is flawed.
It doesn't prove anything. It's strong evidence that it is, in my opinion. But I don't know that we're making any progress on this topic. Oh, so feel free to finish up.
No. I guess if you're saying that it's flawed, that there are people who don't have, then I just don't see how you can make that argument without saying that there should therefore be 100% penetrance of the teachings of Jesus. In other words, so in that case, like
according to what's
the only way you would accept the teachings of Jesus would be they have to be like essentially written in the sky, written on the moon, or burned.
Well, that's not the only way God could have achieved his purposes, but that would have achieved his stated salvific purposes better than what Christians say actually happened. Which is why I don't think that it's a good explanation of what happened. It doesn't well account for what we observed. And Paul is just a symptom of that. It's like, why appear to this random Jew who's a persecutor? It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, we can move. I mean, I'm okay with like moving on, but
that's fine.
But just, I mean, this is not in the context of the debate, but I think you raise valid concerns. I mean, I don't know that those concerns are a stopping point, and I don't know that I can superimpose my understanding and my directives of what God should have been like or what Jesus should do on Jesus or God.
Sure, but that's the problem with the resurrection hypothesis. You have to do that if you are to evaluate the plausibility and explanatory scope of that hyphypothesis.
Yeah,
you can't just say, oh, I can't assess that. Well, then you can't assess the hypothesis. You can just say, I have no idea how plausible this is. If you can't say what God would do, how can you say he would raise Jesus from the dead? That just doesn't make any sense.
No, I can say that I can see why he raised Jesus from the dead without saying that there are still explanatory gaps in what I would perceive that God should do.
How can you say that it's plausible to think that God raised Jesus from the dead, while at the same time saying, I can't assess the reasons God may have had for doing this or that?
It's because of consensus, right? That's the way consensus works, right? There's
consensus
a lot
of whom?
There's a lot. Let's like Christians have a lot of different beliefs, right? So you could say, well, I can't trust anything that any Christians say, right? Because they all have different beliefs. But I would say the areas, and our rational theistic gambler would likely say the same thing, that the areas where there are consensus are underscored by different people with different belief systems, right? So if in other words, if I walk into
let's a room, talk about that a bit more.
Okay,
go ahead.
The point is this: if I walk into a room and there's like 3 different people, and I say, what color is this pen? And some of them say it's navy blue, and some of them say it's peacock blue, and some of them say it's royal blue. I have consensus that the pen is blue, right? So, I think there's sort of a similar argument to be made around Jesus, which is the idea around that consensus. We have we have the Dalai Lama, we have Thich Nhat Hanh, who argues for the divinity of Jesus. We have Swami Vivekananda, we have Gandhi, who argues that like the Sermon on the Mount is one of the greatest things ever written. We have Thomas Jefferson, who definitely denied the miracle accounts of Jesus. So to me, the consensus there is that there's something about Jesus that we have the Islamic faith believes that Jesus had some sort of divine authority, at least in some context. We have the Baha'u'llah, who call Jesus the Son of Man.
Yes, I accept all these examples, right? And so what conclusion can we draw from those? Because that's what I don't quite understand about what you're arguing here.
The conclusion is that there's some sort of divine authority to Jesus.
I don't understand how that follows from the contention. Okay, so from the not from the contention, from the observations you made. So let me explain it how I think about it briefly, and you can respond as to where I'm getting it wrong. So you identify that across the world's, or many of the world's religions and other great thinkers, they have identified Jesus as having many good teachings, and according to their own theological framework, they've identified him as being a prophet, say in Islam, or a divine incarnation of some sort in Buddhism, or just a great moral teacher in the case of like Jefferson. Okay, so how does it follow from that Jesus must have been divine? I don't see the connection there. What it seems to follow from me is that many people appreciate Jesus's teachings and incorporate that into their own theological or philosophical frameworks. which is done for many other figures who have teachings that that people appreciate. So Jesus, I think, had good moral teachings is a statement that many people can appreciate and agree with. But why does it follow from that many people in many different faith traditions have appreciated Jesus' moral teachings and incorporated him into their own theological frameworks? How does it follow from that he must have been a divine figure? Or that he very likely was. You didn't say must, but where does the probability come that he was divine? Because he could have just been a non-divine person who had good teachings, right? Unless you what?
Yeah, and I would probably say, look, if I have the Dalai Lama saying, yeah, there's some good teachings of Immanuel Kant, there's some good teachings of this guy, there's some good teachings of that guy. Like, I don't think that would be a persuasive statement to me. But to me, there's two arguments that need to be made. Number one is that's not what people are saying. People are saying, he was an avatar, which is the highest.
But that's their theological framework. Of course, they're talking about it in their theological framework. I don't like secular philosophers who talk about Jesus don't say that. I don't understand why the fact that people who believe in avatars say that Jesus was an avatar, or in the Muslim case, they say that he was a prophet because they believe in other prophets. Why does that show that he was divine? That's just their own opinions based on their own framework. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. It's just opinions that we're going off of. But I mean, it's what I'm saying is these are all the authorities from different religions. From our rational theistic gambler perspective, let's say we're a decision maker in a theistic paradigm, and we're trying to decide which religious figure we're going to look at, right? As the religious figure with the default highest level of epistemic confidence that they have some divine authority. So what would we do in that paradigm? I think we would look across all the religions, and we would say, well, let me give you a different thought experiment. Let's say you've got every religious figure in a room together, right? And you say you're gonna essentially like give them all ballots on which religious figure they think is the right one, and then you're gonna tally up the ballots. Well, Jesus gets first on his own ballot, presumably, right? And then the other religious figures would probably at the very least put Jesus as second or maybe even tied for first, right? By this analysis, right? So I would walk out of that room saying my epistemic confidence is highest that Jesus has some sort of divine authority if I already have a theological belief system, right? So if I'm theistic and otherwise non-committed. Now, the argument doesn't address two types of people, right? It doesn't address people in your situation. If you're saying I'm an atheist and there's nothing.
No, I'm not saying I'm an atheist. At this point, you can think of me as a deist for the purposes of this discussion.
Okay. Well, let's say let's say there's somebody who's an atheist, right? I could see an atheist saying, I reject that argument because there's nothing that would make me believe in a theistic framework, right? Yeah. So that's one type of person. Another situation where you would reject this argument is you could say, I'm a Pastafarian, and I believe that spaghetti is the ultimate religious good in any theistic conceptualization. Now, that's a subjective preference, right? So the goal of the rational theistic decision maker, the theistic gambler perspective, is to have basically a point of if I'm objective, assuming that I don't have any subjective preferences that I've laid out first of all, then that what position would I be in?
I don't understand why you think that counting up the votes from the adherents of different religions tells us anything about the divine status of Jesus.
Not from the adherents, from the religious figures. And that was a thought.
Well, why does that apply? Well, even so, why is that relevant? Because you're choosing major world religions. Many religions have died out or are very small, and we don't really know what they say about different things, or like sects of other religions. I don't actually know how you count this, right? Well, because that's one problem with your methodology. But the broader issue is, like, why does it matter that Jesus comes second on the Muslim and the Buddhist or the Hindu ballots, right? Because again, what you said before is Jesus was concerned that people consider, whom do you say that I am? And none of those religions agree on who Jesus was. Yes, they agree he was important and had good teachings, but they don't agree. Muslims think he was a prophet, but not the most important prophet, and certainly not the Son of God. Buddhists or Hindus might think he's some sort of reincarnation of an avatar or something like that, but that's very different from what Christians think. They don't agree on who Jesus was. The fact that they all agree that he was someone important, I don't think that doesn't mean that that the Christians are right. I just don't understand that inference. At most, you might say, I think Jesus was someone who was important, but you don't therefore conclude the Christians were right about it.
Well, I mean, and this gets to so let's just briefly come back to my point about the blue pen, right? You're all saying the pen is blue. You're just saying it's different shades of blue or different colors of blue.
No, that's not what the different religions are saying. Like a prophet, but not the Son of God, and one of the three of the Trinity is not a different shade of blue. I don't understand how you can say that. That's just
Well,
ridiculous.
that's what I was going to
They
address.
believe completely different things about Jesus. They just share the belief that he was an important theological figure.
Yeah, and that's why my rational theistic gambler would say, which theistic figure are you going to start with? I think you start with the one that has the highest.
But that is a very modest claim. You start with him. Okay, you start with him. That's fine. I'm happy for it to be starting with. That's not what you claimed before.
And I think what I'm going to say next is going to lay at least some of your objections, which I'm hearing implicitly, is that, you know, I agree with you. Christianity is a very specific set of doctrine, and I would personally argue that. I mean, that's honestly one of the conundrums that I have that made me want to reach out to you. Is I don't necessarily believe in every part of Christian dogma and doctrine. So that's why I carefully in my CTF argument, if people check out the video, I say a theology based on Jesus. Now I do sometimes I do just sometimes say Christianity because it's like a short form. But if somebody pinned me down and they said, do you believe in, you know, do you believe in, I don't know, there's a bunch of stuff in Christianity that I can't say that I literally believe. I'll just give you one example. Like I made a whole video on LGBTQ plus issues and the way it's addressed in Christianity. And I've had a lot of Christians tell me there's no way you could ever call yourself a Christian if you've got such permissive a belief system, right? So I can't define what Christianity is. And to a much greater degree, I can't say that my beliefs are all adherent with Christianity. And like I said, when I started this debate, I have no theological authority. I can't speak for Christianity. I can't speak for any belief system. And I could totally see somebody coming up to me after this debate and saying, you don't speak for Christianity. You don't get to speak for Christianity. And I would totally agree with that. So my point is I'm the rational theistic gambler, and I'm starting with a theology based on Jesus. I'm not saying like, you got to believe every part of, you got to go to the Holy Roman Empire and go through the gates at Jubilee and do all that stuff. I mean, it's yeah.
Well, that does help. And I appreciate that clarification. I think that might be a good place to round things up on it, but I'll give you, if you want to make any final remarks or if there's any things that you wanted to address.
There were a lot of.
I know we didn't cover everything, but
there are a lot of things
we don't have to cover everything in one discussion. But anything that you particularly thought we should, or you want to mention.
I want to encourage people to check out my video of the CTF argument because it's maybe a little more articulate, and I was really glossing over a lot of finer points. And I'll put out another video. I noticed Dale is in the chat, and maybe I'll volunteer some of these files to Dale, and I'll certainly volunteer them to you if you want to like take these arguments and you either read them or use them yourself or. Anyways, my point is that if people want to see my PowerPoint in greater detail, I would really love that. I would encourage people to check out the CTF argument. But the most important thing that I want to say that's probably more important than anything that I've said throughout this video is, Dr. Fodor, you're fantastic intellect. I've learned so much from this conversation. I'm going to rewatch this video and think about a lot of the points where there were a lot of points legitimately during this debate that I think I'm arguing from a contrary perspective, but I think my consensus perspective after rewatching this debate is going to be like, yeah, this point was fairly weak. This point was not that strong. So, and I do want to encourage people to check out all of your website because you really are a polymath, and that's something that's really lost. I'm in a very hyper-focused intellectual and scholarly field, and I'm pretty good in my own field, totally useless when it comes to anything else. And I'm really impressed at the degree to which you've been able to like parlay your intellectual skills to like have a set of tools that can tackle logic or philosophy or theology or neuroscience or computer science or machine learning, AI. It's really impressive. So, and your channel is fantastic and your content is fantastic. So it would be my deepest wish that this conversation would be the first conversation of many that we have. And I hope we get to do a little bit of a wrap up just so I can chat with you a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much again for your time and your kind words. I've watched a few of your videos on your channel, and I was impressed by the way you present your arguments and some of the nuance there. So even if I don't agree with everything, I certainly thought it would be good to have you on, and I did think it was a good discussion, and I'm excited at the prospect of doing more in the future. Maybe we can narrow down the focus at some points or discuss more some of the issues that came up in more depth. But yeah, thanks very much for coming. Thanks everyone in chat for contributing. There was actually quite a lively chat there. And also thanks everyone who's watching on YouTube. Oh, by the way, Tavo, if you want to, I don't know if you want to re-upload this to your channel, but you're welcome to do so afterwards.
Yeah, let's chat about that afterwards and how I would do
Sure, that's fine. Cool. Well, thanks everyone. Take care, and we'll see you in the future. Bye.